right, I'd like to reconvene the meeting of January 20th, and we have gone through roll call, and we'd ask you to join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Could you please stay standing just for a second? We'd like to have a moment of silence. This community has experienced something very unusual in the fact that Mr. Frank Kelly has gone home to God. And the community just came out in droves for him. And he really was a special person. He was a role model for us. And he was an educator, a mentor, a confidant, and a true friend of everyone. So we would like to have a moment of silence for our local treasurer, Mr. Frank Kelly. Thank you very much. Okay. Our next item of business would be our items of consensus. There we go. We'll do the donations first. We have, it's interesting that we should have these tonight and when we're going to be looking at our budget, because it shows us that this community is so really active in helping out the school system, and we really appreciate it. The first one would be the approval of Dunkin' Donuts. Mr. White, do you have them in front of you?
I do.
I'll have you do those.
Yes. We just are very thankful to Mr. Adam Quinn, who is the owner of several franchises of Dunkin' Donuts here in town. I know that many of you know Adam, who very generously donated $5,000 to Wilmington Public Schools and has actually offered to continue to donate in this amount for the next 5 years. And we've having discussions about exactly the intent of that donation. And in the future years, I know he's very interested in helping us to use this money to fund our personalized one-to-one device initiative for those students and families who may not be able to afford to purchase a device. So we certainly are working towards that goal in the future, but we are very grateful to Mr. Quinn.
Thank you. So I'd entertain a motion to accept the donation from Adam Quinn, Dunkin' Donuts of Wilmington franchise owner, in the amount of $5,000. Mrs. Broussard?
So moved.
Second. Mrs. Carroll? All those in favor? Unanimous, Kim? Thank you. Best-selling author James Patterson?
Yes.
Is that-
Actually, Mrs. McMiniman is here, yes. And you know, I don't know a whole lot about how this grant came to be, but it's pretty remarkable that our little North Intermediate School was the recipient of the honor of $5,000 grant from best-selling author James Patterson. I'm sure most people are familiar with, to support the school library. I believe it was through the efforts of Mrs. Heather Peachy. Is that correct? Yeah, from the North Intermediate School, and also our K-12 library coordinator, that we were successful in obtaining this grant, so.
And life is so ironic. When the packet came to the house and I started going through it, I had just put down my James Patterson book so that I could look through it. I couldn't believe it. We would entertain a motion to accept the James Patterson Scholastic Reading Club donation in the amount of $5,000. Mr. Mullis?
Make a motion to approve the donation, James Patterson, for $5,000.
Thank you. Second, Mrs. Bonish. All those in favor? Okay, unanimous. Thank you. And, okay. The next one is the approval of minutes for December 9th, 2015, regular session. Mrs. Broussard.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from December 9th, 2015, regular session.
Okay, do we have a second? Mr. Bjork? Okay, all those in favor? Unanimous, Kim? And then we'll have an out-of-state field trip approval, June 10th, 2016 at I can't even pronounce that, Odeon Park in Rye, New Hampshire. Mrs. Bonish.
Make a motion to approve the out-of-state field trip for June 10th, 2016 for Odeon Park,
Thank you.
Rye, New Hampshire.
Thank you. Second, Mrs. Burns. All those in favor? Unanimous. Thank you. Okay, now we're done. We've made it to the warrants at last. The warrants, G 409, G 410, 411, 412, R208, R209, R210, L 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, and 28. Entertain a motion to accept the warrants. Mrs. Broussard.
So moved.
Second, Mr. Mullis. All those in favor? Unanimous. Then we have the warrants for payroll of 12/9/2015, 12/23, and 1/6/2016. Okay, Mrs. Bonish,
So moved.
and do we have a second? Mrs. Burns. All those in favor? It will be 5 in favor, Kim, 2 abstain, Mrs. Carroll and Mrs. Kane. Warrants CB 05, 06, and 07. Mr. Bjork.
So moved.
Second. Mrs. Broussard. All those in favor? Okay, 6 in favor, 1 would abstain, Mrs. Burns. Warrants sped 08, 09, 10, and 11. Mrs. Broussard.
So moved.
Mrs. Carroll. Second. All those in favor? That would be 6 in favor, 1 abstain, Mrs. Burns. And last set of warrants, food services, 09, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. Mrs. Burns. So moved. Second, Mr. Bjork. All those in favor? Okay. 6 in favor, 1 abstain, Kim. Mrs. Carroll. All right, thank you very much. Our student representative report. It's so nice to see you again.
Well,
We're glad you made it.
I know, it's good to be back. First off, I'd love to start by saying that it is midterm week at the high school. Yay. You know how much fun that is, right? No, but seriously, everyone is taking it seriously and they're working hard to achieve and succeed at their midterms. Especially for the freshmen, since they are first time, they're taking it seriously. It's a midterm, which is the class of 2019. And we had the freshman cram jam last week to help them prepare for it, how you should study, how you shouldn't study, some studying tactics that you should use throughout high school and in college, obviously. And we offered them snacks to fuel their brains and their minds, to keep them going, because obviously no one's going to come and study if we don't say, hey, we have snacks. So that was a way to make them come in, so it's good. And also the mentors also helped them during our free block, which is the W2 period, which is very useful during these times because many freshmen would come into our classes. Like in my W2 class, there was a mentor that helped a freshman with his English midterm studying, and I thought that was very helpful for him because he came up to her and he's like, you know what, that actually helped me understand much more right now rather than studying alone with your friends who also did not know what to do. So it's good to get help from an upperclassman. And also our dedicated teachers were also engaged in academic support night that had finished last week, I suppose, yes, last week, which happened Monday and Tuesday for 2 hours, and it was like a great way to get help from a teacher for homework or tests, also for midterms coming up, and especially for sophomores who are doing the sophomore research paper, because of course W2 is the free block is a nice way to get your work done, but also those 84 minutes aren't enough. Sometimes you need to come after school, and that academic support night also helps many sophomores through that. And these type of programs should happen often because they are very effective for us and for the teachers, because they can, instead of teaching like 20 students at a time, they can just be one-on-one with one student, which is much more, they're much more, like, they pay more attention to one student rather than 20 students. You get the work done. And also next week are talent show auditions. Awesome. Which will take place during March, I'm supposing. And I just love the talent show. I took part of it last year. Got 3rd place. Just throw that out. Thank you. And I just love the talent show because anyone with any kind of talent can join. It's not just like, oh, you need to perform something. It's like, if you have a poetry slam that you want to do, like, go for it. If you want to perform a dance, go for it. You want to rap, go for it. And the WHS is so accepting that, you know what, you do what you got to do. Just showcase your talent. You don't have to be part of a group. You don't have to ask your friends, is this okay to do? Just showcase it, and people will be very surprised that, hey, you got some talent, and, you know, brush your shoulders up. And lastly, I'm very pleased to say that this school has enforced recycling. I've noticed recycling bins at the dish drop-off, in the cafeteria, a couple places in the cafeteria where the vending machines are, near the gym, and by the main lobby when you enter. That's great because people know, and obviously they're very, I like how they're designed because they're very professional. They're not just like those old blue plastic bins. They're kind of like, they look like steel. They have like holes in them. They're like plastic paper, like telling you what goes in there in the design, which is nice, especially during these times when people have their water bottles coming in from midterms and everything. Your plastic water bottles, just dispose of them as you exit the building, which is really nice. And you know what? Like, it takes small steps to achieve your goal, and in the environmental club is just to make this, not just the high school, but the entire community environmentally advanced in Wilmington. And getting recycling enforced in a matter of months, literally months, not years, but months in the new school is a very big step, baby step forward to make the Wilmington School District environmentally advanced. And to end my very short and sweet report, I have a quote from Lao Tzu. Very sorry if I mispronounced that, but tried. It is a quote that says, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step."
Very nice. Could you tell us what the 3rd place talent was?
Oh, I did Bollywood dancing.
Oh,
Very cool.
wow. We'll have to find out when that is for this year.
Yeah,
Sounds like
come on
fun.
in. It's good.
Good for you.
Fundraiser for the entire school too, so funds
Excellent.
the science club too. Yeah.
Great, that's wonderful. Any questions or comments? Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for waiting.
No, I love
really-
waiting. It's good. I actually love
Okay.
waiting. You get to your goal. You don't get anywhere by being impatient. So,
Very nice. I think you're going to be a philosopher. Good job. Thank you
Thank
for coming
you.
on. All right, our next item of business would be the superintendent's report.
Don't have any talents to showcase. I'll put that right out there. I just wanted to start off by just talking a little bit about the incident that occurred yesterday at Shawsheen Elementary School. And I know that the school committee is aware, and certainly the Shawsheen school community, but certainly the whole community, if they didn't have a student at the Shawsheen, might not be aware, although it's certainly been prominently featured in the news, what's been happening. As you might know, this was not just a Wilmington issue. There has been a rash of threats, and not just bomb threats, but involving weapons and explosives. Approximately 20 to 25 districts in Massachusetts between Friday, the 15th, as well as Tuesday, the 19th, and then even today, there were additional threats across the state. And districts of all sizes and locations, mostly the eastern part, so from Worcester eastward. We're also not the only state to have had this happen. New Jersey had about 26 school districts yesterday who were targeted by a similar type of automated type threats that were made specifically to schools. We just want our community to know that, first of all, we have very strong protocols in place that we utilize to assess threats when those threats come about. We are very fortunate in this community to have Lieutenant Scott Sensabaugh, who is a leader in school security in this state, and he's, 100 yards from my office, or maybe a little more. And he, whenever possible, he's always the person, along with other police department staff, who comes and responds to those. So we follow our threat assessment protocols, and we make decisions based on those protocols. We assess the level of threat, the level of risk, and we make decisions around whether it's appropriate or not to evacuate the school, whether it's appropriate to just shelter in place and search the school. So those decisions are made context-specific depending upon the threat. So we just want the community to know that we might not always be able to share with the community or parents all of the information, because obviously when these things happen, it turns into an ongoing investigation. And we, of course, have an agreement with the Wilmington Police Department that we won't do anything to hinder their investigation. And we rely on them to help us assess what information to release, obviously, to the public. So it's very frustrating, of course, as school administrators, to have to deal with these hoaxes. It's very disruptive, but we just want the community to know that every situation is different. We take each one individually, and we apply the same set of threat assessment protocols and make decisions accordingly to make sure that our students and our staff are safe. So just wanted to update you. We don't know where this is going. We don't know if we'll continue to see additional threats or not, but I know that not only our local police departments and regional police collaboratives involved, but the state police are involved, and the FBI are involved as well in trying to get to the bottom of these specific rash of threats that we've been experiencing. I just also wanted to let you know that the school committee policy book has been completely updated and now reflects all of the new policies that have been adopted since 2006. And the policy book is available in paper format at Roman House. It is a rather weighty document, but it's also available now online for those who want to access those policies online. And finally, just some upcoming dates to be aware of. January 21st, that's tomorrow, Family Literacy Night at the Woburn Street School at 6:30 p.m. January 22nd is preschool parent conferences. And on January 28th, we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Ross Green visiting us. You all know Dr. Green because his book was your summer reading project, Lost at School. He is the developer of the CPS model, Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, and he will be here to speak to any staff who care to attend, and we'll also have some staff from the West Intermediate School on hand that have been participating in the pilot program to be able to share with other staff members the successes of that program. If any school committee members are interested in attending, I know that Mr. Burock has expressed an interest. Certainly, you're welcome to attend, and that's at 3:15 in the middle school auditorium. And that, again, that's Thursday, January 28th, so a week from tomorrow. I wanted to also let you know that we received a very nice letter. I received a copy of a very nice letter from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Office of Health and Human Services, specifically the Soldiers Home in Chelsea, extending their heartfelt gratitude to the students of Wilmington High for the very thoughtful donation of handmade Christmas cards and banners. And we thank Dawn Martell and all the students who worked with her for that. And that's a nice acknowledgement on their behalf. They do such great work. And then last but not least, I just distribute to you a memo that we received from Town Manager Jeff Hall, who's actually here with us today. We'll speak later about budget. This is a schedule for the Finance Committee fiscal year 2017 budget and finance meetings. And you'll see on here at the very bottom, Tuesday, March 8th is the date that the Wilmington School Committee will, and Wilmington Public Schools will present their budget to, if I gave one more to go that way.
Oh, we have to wait one more. Thank you. Anyone have any questions about the list or anything? All right, thank you.
For the Ross Green event, do you need an RSVP to that?
No, you don't have to let me, if it's a last-minute decision
Okay.
based on schedule, that's fine.
Great,
We
thank
should
you.
have plenty of seats available.
Great. Thank
Well,
you.
I'd love it if it was standing room only, but hopefully we'll.
Sounds good. All right, next items of business, under new business. This is July.
Yes, first order of business, under new business, is a report from Mr. Harrison, our athletic director, on the athletic fall 2015 season review. The microphone or the one, or over, you can sit by Paul too if you'd like.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'd like to take this opportunity to, mention some of the fall 2015 highlights and also some of our Middlesex League All-Stars. Starting out with cross-country, coached by Brian Schall. We had Elizabeth Olson, was a Middlesex League All-Star. In golf, coached by Steve Lynch. We had Billy McAvoy, was an All-Star. In volleyball, Dishan Bayeo was our Middlesex League All-Star, coached by Megan Sheehy. In soccer, coached by Steve Scanlon. We had two. We had Matt Spur and Brian Kavanaugh. Our girls' soccer program went undefeated in league play for the first time ever, coached by Sue Hendy. It was our fifth consecutive first-place finish in the Middlesex League Freedom Division. We had Middlesex League All-Stars Devin Malatesta, Christina Spinos, Kelly Souza, Casey McFall, Jordan Ganara, Kayla McCauley, and Olivia Wingate. Also, we had an Eastern Mass Division II first-team All-Star in Devin Malatesta and Christina Spinos. Christina Spinos and Kelly Souza were also named to the Lowell Sun All-Star team. And then Devin Malatesta was not only a Boston Globe, but also a Boston Herald All-Scholastic. So it was obviously a great year for our girls' soccer program. Football, coached by Mike Barry. We had Matt Woods and Kyle Nelson. Field hockey program, coached by the illustrious Leanne Ebert, who's right behind us over here. Like I said, we finished second in the Middlesex League division for, I don't know, probably about the fourth or fifth year in a row, to Watertown, who has been the state champs for, I think, the last 7 years in a row. But we had Middlesex League All-Stars, Melissa McNamara, Bridget Sullivan, Jacqueline Frazier, and Julian Milley. And also Melissa McNamara and Bridget Sullivan were also Lowell Sun All-Stars. Cheerleading, coached by Nicole Miguel French, finished second in the Middlesex League cheering competition this past fall. I'd like to just add, our winter season is basically half over, but I do want to mention one of our programs, and it's our girls' winter track, which is undefeated at this time right now. They are at least co-champs, and if they beat Burlington on February 1st, they will be league champs by themselves. And we've been trying to research it, and I think this is the first championship for our winter track girls. Well, I'm back to 74 right now, all right, and I have, and as we talked about at the beginning of the meeting here, our go-to guy is no longer with us. Mr. Kelly is, I mean, he knows everything. He knew everything. You could ask him a question like this and he'd answer it within 10 seconds. So we are trying to find that out right now, but as I said, it's a great, great opportunity for our girls. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and of course, we would like to say to you, we'll have other opportunities, but we're sorry that this is your last report to us on one hand, but we're very happy for you on the other hand, especially from someone else who's retired.
Thank you very much.
When you're going into it, you can't believe that's really happening to you, but then you get that whole other life, and it'll be wonderful,
Well,
but
I'm waiting for that, yes.
we'll definitely be talking about this later in the year, but we wish you good, very best of luck.
All right.
Thank you for all you've done for Wilmington.
No, not a problem, thank you. And we're off to hockey.
Enjoy, don't be too cold. Okay.
Yes. Our next item of business is a very special honor to a very special person who Mr. Harrison noted is here with us today. And I know the school committee enjoys being able to present certificates of commendations to those who have had some great achievements. And we just want to recognize, the school committee wants to recognize Leanne Ebert for her accomplishments in terms of being named the Coach of the Year for 2015. And I just want to read here that of the 15 varsity athletic teams, 6 teams advanced to the state tournament, with only 2 of those teams winning a state tournament. And while the field hockey team did not get there, I think we all recognize the challenge that faced them when they faced the powerhouse that is Watertown Field Hockey, who I believe actually went on to win, and actually went on to beat everybody, right, shutouts in all of their games after that, Watertown. So just a quote from an article that Jamie Pote wrote about Leanne Ebert, where he notes that Leanne is, actually this is Mr. Harrison's quote, Leanne is a great coach. She is well respected by our student athletes, peers, and opposing coaches. She has a very special way of getting the most out of her teams, not only to play well, but to show good sportsmanship as well. So we thank Leanne for her dedication to our student athletes and all she does, both on the field, but also off the field with our students. So congratulations.
I'd just like to add one thing, that sometimes I think we don't realize what the coaches, all of the coaches give up, and how much time they spend with their school family. And they also have another family at home who actually, I think, come to a lot of the games and support them. But we really thank you for the time that you give, Leanne, and your fellow coaches, that we do realize how much hard work it is, and we appreciate it. And I think the second thing that Mr. Lai just said about the idea of how people should have sportsmanship, and how you're not there just to win. And that's the philosophy that we feel, that you're there to, the kids should be having a great time, and they should have a good relationship with you, and you foster that in your students. So we really thank you a lot. Okay, thank you. And you don't have to stay for the whole meeting after we've talked to different people.
You have to tell Mr. Harrison that twice.
Yeah.
I'll consider.
I love that. All right, we're going to do the budget next.
That's correct. And before I do the presentation of the superintendent's recommended budget, per your request, I extended the invitation to Jeff Hall, the town manager, to come and provide you some information more broadly about the state of the town budget and town revenues, and kind of set the context for us as we discuss and deliberate specifically the school department budget. So Jeff, if you want to, either side, whatever's convenient.
We haven't quite settled into the best way to do these things here. And if anyone comes up with any ideas about how to seat us, this can't continue like that. You're behind us. Someday we're going to find the right way to get it.
Thank you.
Evening. Thank you for coming.
I appreciate the opportunity. Mary spoke with me probably a month and a half or so ago about the idea of coming before the school committee and presenting to you essentially the approach that I take in terms of developing the revenues, what goes into that process. So I want to talk to you a bit about that, a little bit about the history of where Wilmington has been with regard to revenues, and also my general philosophy, if you will, in terms of our revenue projections. And I would say, in terms of the overall mantra, for me, it's sustainability. That is sustainability of our operations. We need to be able to have an operational budget that stays within the revenues that we have available. So each year, I begin the development from the vantage point of understanding the past. And one of the advantages, quite honestly, of having been here as long as I've been, and it's hard to believe, but started here in 1987, is some of the institutional history. And I remember very distinctly back in 1990 when the town pursued an override at the time, and it actually passed at town meeting, but at the ballot it was overwhelmingly defeated. And one of the first, in fact I would say the first challenge for my predecessor, Mike Kyra, was coming in and trying to figure out how to deal with a $838,000 deficit. There was a lot of conversation with all of the general government departments, certainly the school department, and ultimately over time, in a relatively short period of time, in fact, there was a special town meeting that summer, we were able to get a balanced budget. But at that time, there was no free cash. In fact, in some of the years leading up to 90, there were actually negative free cash balances. So there was no free cash to access. The town was taxing to the levy limit, so there was no room there. So it became an issue of trying to figure out where cuts could be made, where vacancies perhaps were not filled. And so those are the kind of circumstances that we had to deal with at that time. I just also note that I was also here during the early 2000s when the town drew down its free cash balance, which had accrued over time, thanks in large measure to Mike Kyra and cooperating with the various school superintendents at the time. We had accrued a free cash balance of over $9 million. And then when we had the downturn in the 2003 stretch through 2007 or 8, we literally drew down $6 million in free cash to sustain the operations, avoid layoffs. There were certainly vacancies that weren't filled, but we went from $9 million plus down to about $3 million over that stretch. And unfortunately, unlike many communities, we had the ability to do that because we had set the money aside. So I'm pleased now as a town manager to be able to continue to work in securing the town's strong financial position and hopefully to be in a position to stand the test of economic downturns, support major capital investments, and address the long-term liabilities that threaten other municipalities and us throughout the state. I'm mindful of the challenge of balancing today's needs and future liabilities against what taxpayers are able and willing to pay, and have appreciated the school committee's longstanding partnership in supporting a sustainable approach to budgeting school services. Cycles of growth and decline in the economy are becoming less predictable, and as markets and fortunes move at the speed of technology and the global economy, the crash of 2007 proved that downturns are swift, drastic, and can impact all aspects of the community. With this knowledge, the town is deliberate in taking a conservative approach to revenue projections. The town historically taxes to the Proposition 2.5 levy limit. This approach leaves no levy capacity for times of need. New growth projections are added to the calculated levy limit. In each year, we estimate the new growth based upon current permit activity, discussions with developers, and historic data. For the past several years, we have exceeded our new growth projections. In the most recent years, the excess growth has been predominantly attributed to personal property, which is equipment that many of our employers have in town, as opposed to real estate investment. Therefore, due to the lack of discernible patterns and a general volatility in new growth, this revenue source is one of the most conservative projected factors in the budget. And I would note, one of the issues of some concern with regard to the fact that most recently our new growth has come in large part from the personal property is that that isn't, may not be as consistent as, for example, the regular renovation of homes. You see a lot of homes now being torn down and newer, larger homes being built. There's some level of sustainability with that. Our assessor, Karen Rashis, when she came in a couple of years ago, one of her first jobs was to really take a look at our personal property. And what she found was that there were a number of companies in town where we weren't capturing that personal property. For whatever reason, the information hadn't been reported. And so it was kind of low-hanging fruit, so to speak. We were able to identify that and apply the proper tax to it, and that came through as new growth. So, you know, as that low-hanging fruit, so to speak, goes away, you know, there's less of a guarantee that the levels of growth in personal property will continue to be there. This chart just reflects for you where our revenues have gone over the last several years, from 2008 to the estimated 2017, and you'll see there's a fluctuation of essentially no growth in 2012, or just barely 0.3, up to the high water mark in 13 of 8.8. So it is all over the place, and it's very difficult to establish a particular number. I would note that the 2017 number is still a very rough estimate as I'm finalizing the budget, which I'll present to the Board of Selectmen on February 1st. The remaining revenue is derived from local receipts such as excise tax, meals tax, revenues from permits and licenses and state aid, Chapter 70, and unrestricted local aid. The local receipts and permit revenue tend to follow economic cycles and consumer confidence, which remains extremely volatile as we head into 2016. State aid saw a minimal increase in Chapter 70 last year. However, with projected budget gaps caused by the state's over-projection of revenues combined with the legislature's renewed focus on rebuilding their own depleted rainy day reserve, I believe any significant increase in state funding is unlikely in 2017 and in the near future. This graph at the bottom reflects the variation over the last several years in terms of local receipts and local aid. You know, I would just add, in terms of the state's own situation, so as you know from the media, there's not only the overestimate of revenues from the Plainville Casino, there's the MBTA issue that they're trying to deal with, there's the Department of Child Services issue that they're trying to deal with. All these things are going to require some amount of financial resources. In addition to S&P basically telling the state that they have concerns over the fact that in a relatively good economic time, their rainy day fund has been depleted to a level of concern, and S&P has suggested that if they don't start to change that, they're going to review their rating. So again, I think all things considered, the state is going to be hard-pressed to provide cities and towns with significant additional revenue. While we continue to attempt to make reasoned estimates about future revenue growth, it's not possible to accurately anticipate when the next economic downturn will occur, the scale or duration of the downturn, and the state's response to it. We have seen over the past 10 years a consistent move by the state to trim local aid and grant programs that fund municipal operations. These moves include the abandonment of programs such as the Quinn education incentive for police, which was several $100,000 to the town a few years ago, and the recent proposed defunding of full-day kindergarten grants. As we have seen in the past decade, local receipts and local aid sources cannot be counted on to grow each year. Due to these factors, a conservative approach to revenue projections has allowed us to be flexible to absorb the fluctuations in new growth, downturns in local receipts, and cuts in state aid without impacting services. In good years, as we have been experiencing most recently, we are able to take direct excess revenue into our reserve accounts and to unanticipated opportunities such as the Main Street purchase of property. I would just note, in terms of the reserve, the free cash number, because there's been a lot of discussion about this, I think a good analogy for me anyways is, you know, we've certainly seen in the last several years, last few years, that, you know, our free cash balance as of fiscal 14, the end of 14, was $14.4 million. It had grown from, I believe it was 12 million, 13 million before that. So it's been certainly a significant number. But, you know, I equate it a little bit to, you know, my two sons who think that it's just a matter of course that the Patriots are always in the playoffs. They don't remember, as I do, when I was a kid, that the Patriots never made the playoffs. And so similarly, you know, you look back on this chart below in terms of free cash, and there were basically through the 80s into the early 90s, the town had no free cash, and in some cases negative free cash, and then it went up and down. So, you know, I think I just want to emphasize the fact that the free cash that has accrued over recent years was by design, and, you know, we can't always anticipate that we're going to be able to maintain that level of free cash balance. Through a combination of strong budget management and growing economy, our free cash balance grew to a 10-year high of 16% of the annual budget in 2014. This has led to many discussions about the balance and what should be done with it. What tends to be overlooked is that the town had reserves of less than 5% of its budget as recently as 2008. The town did not meet the 10% of reserve fund balance typically recommended by bond agencies until 2012. Consistent with the financial best practices, the town does not use free cash for annual and ongoing operating expenses. And I think this is a very important point because when, if we were to use free cash for operating expenses, salaries, you know, day-to-day expenses, those costs become embedded in the budget, and we can't always rely on the same level of free cash over time. So that's really why, you know, both my predecessor and I have taken the approach that it's just not wise to fund operating expenses from free cash. Standard & Poor's recently reviewed the town's financial position and reaffirmed the AA+ bond rating. In the review, the town was scored positively for its efforts to maintain reserve balances in the recommended range of 10 to 15% of annual budget. With the proposed transfer and appropriation, the town expects to remain within the recommended range in fiscal 2017. This graph illustrates the change in the stabilization account, the total expenditures versus free cash balances, and you'll see that there's, you know, it hasn't been consistent. There's been some declines, some increases. We've enjoyed a relatively good stretch here of increases, a slight decrease in 15, but you know, it is somewhat volatile. Reserve fund balances are important as they serve multiple purposes. The town's reserve fund balance demonstrates to investors our ability to fund obligations over time, which in turn results in lower borrowing costs. This factor will be critical as we look at borrowing associated with the 5-year capital plan and the facilities master plan. Additionally, the reserve fund balance serves as a rainy day fund that we may need to weather the rough financial times. Since the town taxes to the levy limit, without reserve funds, the only other mechanism of funding operations is an override. Wilmington sought overrides in 1989 and 1990, and both attempts failed. Unlike a debt exclusion, which temporarily increases tax revenues for a specific project, an override permanently increases the levy limit and is built into all future Proposition 2.5 levy increases. Finally, reserve fund balances are used to pursue unforeseen opportunities and allow investment in large projects without having to rely solely on debt. Recent examples of cash use included, free cash use, included the purchase of the Main Street property adjacent to St. Dorothy's and the replacement of a boiler at the Shawsheen School for $480,000. Despite the strong reserves and conservative approach to our budgeting, Standard & Poor's did not see a AAA bond-rated community in Wilmington when they reviewed us in 2015. We retained our AA+ rating, which indicates the town is continuing a sound approach to management, yet there is still work to be done. Since becoming town manager, I have sought to control budget increases in a way that ensures that services are sustainable for the long term. I have generally sought to keep budget increases to 3% each year. This increase allows the town to absorb regular cost inflation, fund new initiatives, continue our healthy investment in capital, and preserve and grow reserve funds. Despite these efforts, there is still a long-term prospect of expenditures exceeding our revenues. Projections currently show a potential deficit in the future. The expenditure drivers include, in order of significance, school expenditures, insurance, statutory charges, and debt. And this chart just reflects, again, this is an estimate. It's certainly, things can change, and it's subject to change, obviously. This projection assumes a 3% annual increase in revenue. It also assumes a 4% annual increase in the school budget, which is slightly higher than the average increase since 2012, yet 0.2% lower than the average increase over the past 2 years. It also assumes a 9% increase in health insurance, which is 2% lower than the national projected health care inflation plus Affordable Care Act costs. The town has averaged an annual increase of 8.7% of health insurance since 2011. However, not all cost provisions of the Affordable Care Act have been implemented yet. Otherwise, assumptions include a 2.5% increase in all other town departments, a 1% increase in debt, and a 5% increase in statutory charges, which include things like the MWRA assessment, the MBTA assessment, and other similar assessments. A swing of just 1% can cause a major impact on the projections. If expenditures are to grow an additional 1% above present projections, the gap between revenues and expenditures triples. For this reason, I place a high priority on managing expenditure growth. In addition to addressing the potential future budget gap, the town must also address the long-term liabilities of capital, retirement, and the other post-employment benefits, otherwise known as OPEB. Our 5-year capital improvement plan has in excess of $30 million in identified needs through 2021. The amount does not include projects that will be identified through the facilities master plan process. We cannot possibly absorb the cost of all of these needs through the annual operating budget without timing projects and debt issuance carefully and utilizing reserves as a supplement. The future liability for our Middlesex retirement is $73 million. The town must fully fund this obligation by 2035. Our OPEB liability, based upon the actuarial study completed in 2015, is $119 million. I would note, on a positive note, that this is our third actuarial audit now. The first audit we had, they identified a liability of $137 million. The audit that was done 4 years ago targeted us at 133. We're down to 119 million, which is certainly going in a good direction. I think part of that is a reflection of what we had done a few years ago in terms of our health insurance, changes in health insurance plans. but also has to do with the assumptions that the actuary has in terms of the rate of medical inflation. So it is good news, but certainly $119 million is still a long ways to go. As offsetting reserves, we have appropriated $750,000 for the retirement liability and $1.6 million for the stabilization associated with the OPEB. Standard & Poor's expressed a measure of concern relative to the town's mid- and long-term ability to make consistent, adequate contributions to the OPEB stabilization fund. And this is really what I gathered from the report that came back from the Standard & Poor's. One of the principal reasons why we did not go from a AA+ to a AAA community. I think they were very impressed with the budget flexibility we have because of our reserves, the fact that departments across the board have been consistently able to spend within their means. But one of the things they did comment on, in spite of the fact that in the last few years we've put the $750,000 into retirement and $1.6 into OPEB, they have some measure of concern about our ability to continue those kind of investments over the longer term. So, you know, we have to make the case to them that we're going to be able to do that. And that's only part of the issue, because with OPEB, as I note here, we can't fund our way out of this. We're going to have to have some very frank conversations with the employees about ways to modify the health plan benefits in a way that is reasonable, but is going to be able to control costs. And I just would note as an aside that the health insurance committee has been meeting again, started meeting, I guess, last fall. Kendra Amaral, the assistant manager, has been involved, Mike Morris, Paul, and representatives from each of the unions have been participating. And one of the things that I've been impressed with from the information I'm getting back is that the group is really engaged in trying to understand what the concerns are with respect to health insurance, and I'm anticipating some good things will come out of that in terms of recommendations. If not managed, retirement and OPEB costs will divert an increasing amount of resources from direct services to these obligations. It is not possible to fund our way out of this challenge. The strategy must be twofold and incorporate both funding through reserve fund balances and cost savings in both staffing and staff benefits. I would note, just as also as a matter of a point of information, one of the concerns I think we have to be mindful of is the addition of personnel. The actuary that provided our most recent update estimates that the cost in terms of OPEB liability for each new employee is roughly $82,000. So when we bring on individuals, that currently is what the actuary is estimating is going to be the added tab, if you will, over the course of their, and you know, they have certain assumptions in terms of how long that employee will work for the town. But so I just point that out because I certainly am mindful of it in terms of when we're looking at, you know, possible changes in staffing. In conclusion, despite the projections above, the future for Wilmington is still a positive one if we maintain our conservative approach to budgeting, continue to maintain reserve funds, and work to address our long-term liabilities. It requires a measure of restraint and, in many cases, the challenge of prioritizing needs and wants. The desire to spend down the reserves and increase annual operating costs because we have healthy reserves is hard to resist. However, if Wilmington is to remain affordable for families and desirable for businesses, we must continue the conservative approach to financial management and to make good decisions now with an eye towards the future. And again, in a word, I think it's sustainability. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just at this time insert a little something that I wanted to thank you and Mr. Hooper for the fact that you've been going through the Roman house and finding a few things that we really needed to upgrade to make it a sustainable place for the people to still work. And I'm really impressed with that, and I think that you heard us discussing the problem, and the fact that we are going to wait our turn on the facilities report and looking forward to it. But until then, it was so nice that you heard us and you were able to do just some little things, but they mean a lot to the people in the building.
I was over at the Roman House just the other day, meeting with Mary, and I hadn't been over in a little bit, and I was very impressed with the new kitchen area that George and his people had put together. I mean, George, and I commend both him and his staff, but he is really invested in the town, and to the extent he can, work things through. It's a bit of being a MacGyver, I guess, in terms of dealing with the Roman House, because it's a tough building, there's no question.
And the handle going down, coming in and out of the building, that makes such a huge difference.
Yeah.
Outside, thank you so much. So I wanted to thank you for taking care of those things. And that really shows, we really all want to cooperate, and it's for the benefit of everybody in the end. But this was very interesting, because for the first time, I was thinking, what's the problem here? You got 14 million, give us 2 million and do the Roman house. And I know it must have been getting to you, but it really makes me understand that you'd have to have, I understand now why we have to have the things in reserve, and this is the way to go. And I commend you that you're able to keep people like me in line to do that, so thank you. I hope you'll be staying with us, and please sit right there while Mary, is that good? And you know what else? I just have to say, Jeff, I know you're working on a huge report for the Board of Selectmen, and for you to take the time to put this together for us, I think we all thank you very much for doing that.
You're welcome.
Yes. Okay. Oh, does anyone have any questions on? Yes.
I really like that opportunity and appreciate you coming, spending your time coming tonight to present this. Of course, I've got a lot of things in my mind saying, be mindful though, I know that you guys have been very supportive of the budget, the statewide, where it affects public education, and your support and that of the selectmen, truly appreciative. Again, where we find ourselves back at square one with the state, but I too have to agree with, I appreciate the understanding of the larger picture that you and the Board of Selectmen face in setting up the budget for the upcoming year, and I just want to say thank you for it.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
We all set? Okay.
Okay. So as you know, as I head into the superintendent's recommended budget, I presented to you back in December a preliminary budget for 2017, which when we put all of the different requests into the budget, and that wasn't even all of the requests made, had us at about a 5.75% increase. And as you know, the process here at Wilmington is that the Director of Finance and Administration, the superintendent meet with the town manager and assistant town manager and town accountant, and we get this similar type of overview on the revenue situation and have some conversations about what can and cannot be done, and come to an understanding about what is, to use Jeff's word, sustainable. So the recommended budget is basically post those discussions, and we'll walk through some of those adjustments that were made, but also to tell the story. And a lot of the charts and graphs that you'll see in this presentation are within the budget document that you received, which hopefully you felt provided you with a good deal of background information as well. But to tell the story of how we came to develop the budget that is before you. So here are some of our budget highlights, and you saw some of this in the presentation of the preliminary budget. We're looking to ensure that we're supporting students by increasing our adjustment counseling staff, health education, English language learners, and behavioral health staffing, as well as some programmatic improvements in those areas. looking to enhance service delivery to students with special needs through job-embedded coaching, through consulting and professional development, specifically around inclusive practices and differentiated instruction. We look to develop leadership capacity and foster and facilitate teacher collaboration through continued professional development, as well as innovative scheduling, and also supporting the transition to a balanced literacy model of reading and writing instruction through, again, job-embedded coaching and professional development. So those are sort of our high-level objectives in this budget document. And I know that you can't see that, and I think the very bottom is actually cut off on the slide. But the very bottom, the increase for the FY17 recommended budget, the overall increase is 4%. And the key budget drivers, you can see salary and other compensation, not surprisingly, is our key budget driver. About 80% of our budget, 80% on average of any school budget is made up of personnel. We are a very personnel-rich environment with our staffing. We did make some overall reductions in the area of instructional materials and supplies. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it is an area of historical underspending for Wilmington Public Schools that certainly is not necessarily sustainable, but we'll talk a little bit about that. And then contract services, mostly driven by transportation, and in that category, special education transportation, and similarly under other expense, a significant portion of that is special education tuitions, but also some professional development and other related expenses. So for the FY17 budget, 79% of our total budget is comprised of salary and other compensation. Collectively bargained and non-union increases represent 75% of that additional amount. And as you can see, that split on that is 89% of it is for the contractual step, lane, and cost of living increases that are in our collective bargaining agreements. And the remainder is for non-union salary increases and other compensation, but it also includes the fact that we have assumed that the kindergarten grant from the state will be cut in half next year and completely eliminated the following year. So we've had to absorb $50,000 in staffing costs to cover that anticipated reduction in the kindergarten grant. And here are the positions that we have requested in the FY17 budget: a behavioral health coordinator, a .5 FTE ELL teacher. I know that you heard from Sue McDonald earlier in the year about some of the challenges with not only the number of students, but also the variety of different languages that they need to address as well, and the level of services provided and the ability to accommodate that with the given schedules that we have with 1.5 FTEs is pretty challenging. 2.5 FTEs, this is down from our original estimate of 4 FTEs to establish a new social emotional support program at Wilmington Middle School. A full-time health educator position that would actually be shared between the two intermediate schools. And again, this is to teach grade 5 health, where we currently offer no health in grade 5. An adjustment counselor for the 2 early childhood centers. Again, there are no behavioral health staff supporting students at this very foundational early age. And then a behavior intervention support staff person at the Shawsheen Elementary School. The school houses several of our special education programs. Some of those students have behavioral challenges. In addition, though, we have seen just an increase in students with behavioral challenges, which I think, hopefully, long-term, our goal is to address those by putting behavioral health supports in place at the early childhood level and teaching those self-regulation and those coping skills, resiliency skills to students so that perhaps they are in a much better place by the time they get to the primary grade levels and beyond. Recognizing that we could not afford with a 4% increase versus 5.75 all those increases in positions. We have restructured or reallocated positions, or are proposing to do so in order to balance this budget and get us from the 5.75 to the 4%. It includes a position at the middle school, 3 positions at the high school, and a transfer of an existing position from somewhere at the elementary level to the Shawshene School. We do have shifting enrollments that should hopefully allow us to perhaps collapse a grade level at a school and transfer a teacher rather than adding a teacher at grade 3. So those other positions you see up there at middle school and high school would be reductions in FTEs. In terms of instructional materials and supplies, a lot of this is driven by replacement of consumables. We have consumables in virtually all subject areas, specifically, science and art and math, physical education, technology maintenance. So that's a cost driver. We also had a request from the high school for $83,000 to fund foreign language textbooks. We reduced that in half to get to the 4% budget, so that's $4188. And in addition, we eliminated this expense from the operating budget by shifting that expense to certain grant and revolving funds that we have available. So we will still look to fund the $41,888 in those foreign language textbooks, but it will be an off-budget expense. So I mentioned about instructional materials and supplies and some of the concerns. I think it's important for the committee to realize that the average per pupil expenditure among comparable districts for instructional materials and supplies is $310. Wilmington spends an average of $95, which is $210 per pupil below average comparable districts. I see it in a variety of places. I can tell you that one of the places that I really see it as I walk through classrooms, particularly a variety of levels, are in the availability of books in classroom libraries and texts. And that's going to have to shift, because if we're going to make a commitment to do balanced libraries, we're going to have to build those libraries because kids need those books to read. That's the key instructional material you need. So I think that's where we find where we're lacking. That's where we end up taking the hit on those expenses. In terms of our contract services, increases in special education transportation obligations, $119,000. We did tweak our circuit breaker offset, so in the net, we're only adding $78,000 to the budget. That was up a little bit higher, but we shifted some of that to circuit breaker. We're also looking for $50,000 to fund the literacy, coaching, consulting, and professional development to transition to balanced literacy. As you know, our K-5 literacy coach, Holly Banashevitz, and I should acknowledge, and I apologize profusely, that all these folks behind, comprising our district leadership, are all here, not just to support us, but to also answer any questions. So all of our principals, early childhood directors, and our district level administrators, as well as our elementary math specialists, our K-5 literacy coach, our director of nursing services, all here to support and answer questions on this. $25,000 for inclusion consulting services to help us in implementing and making the transition to stronger inclusionary practices. And so that remains in the budget. To go back to the $50,000. That $50,000, we actually shifted that as well to grant and revolving funds. This is a commitment that we will have to make each year, and once we invest, we need to know that we're going to continue to invest in that. But for this current year, we did have some unrestricted funds that we could transfer this expense to reduce that budget down to the 4%. We have a $10,000 regular education increase. That's basically the contractual rate increase. The contract has an inflation factor in each of the 3 years of the contract, and an increase in home and hospital tutoring. We've had far more students and have an increasing number of students who require these services who are at home or hospitalized for a variety of reasons, most notably for behavioral health, mental health reasons. And in terms of other expenses, the majority of this increase, 80% of it, goes to fund known or anticipated increase in special education tuitions. There's also funding included in there to the tune of $34,463 for some of the curriculum and professional development activities that are in our district strategic plan. That includes things like continuing to develop curriculum maps to align our curriculum to the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks, universal design for learning, positive behavioral interventions and supports. These are all key components of offering multi-tiered systems of support. And finally, $19,000 to electricity at the high school, and we talked about that during the preliminary budget presentation. You're familiar with the budget calendar. This was in our presentation in our budget book as well. And here we are right now in January, presenting the superintendent's recommended budget. So the next steps of the process are the town manager, as you mentioned, will present to the Board of Selectmen, and you have a budget hearing scheduled for February 10th. Take a vote to adopt the budget, and then we then present to the Town Finance Committee on March 8th, and town meeting this year on April 30th.
If I could just note, the Finance Committee public hearing is March 15th.
Okay, that's a good thing to note as well. Just to show you graphically, one of the first things we look at, obviously, in developing a budget is what is enrollment doing. You can see from this graph that over the past several years, our enrollment has been modestly declining. We are down several hundred students since 6 or 7 years ago. You also can see that it's not necessarily coming from one grade level. The enrollments are declining at the elementary level. They're declining, actually probably a little more stability here in the middle school level and at the high school level, and we'll show you some information on that a little bit later. And this just shows you at each grade level. And you can see that if you go down one of these columns, you can see the extreme fluctuation. So while the trend overall might be down, you can see that there's a lot of fluctuation, particularly at the lower grade levels. You can see that at 9-12, we saw increasing enrollments in the late 90s into the mid-2000s, reaching a peak right here in 2007-8, and since that time essentially has been on the decline, and a similar pattern at the middle school level. So why are enrollments doing what they're doing? This is a very telling chart. This shows population changes between 2000 and 2010. A couple things to note. First of all, the declines overall in our younger groups. So this is children ages 0 to 9. This is a big part of our school-age population, and there has been a decrease from 2000 to 2010 in that school-age population. The other trend of note is this right here. These ages are your primary child-rearing ages, and there has been some significant declines in that population in the last 10 years. And obviously, this is a trend that we're all familiar with, is increase in the population, the baby boomer influence. So in addition to those population trends and their impact on enrollment, we also see that we do have a certain percentage of students that we lose to other schools. And this chart shows you that at the K-8 level, this was just for last year, enrollment in K-8 schools, not Wilmington Public Schools. And so we have 84 students enrolled at the K-8 level in other schools, and this shows you some of the schools and which ones are popular. Obviously, Abundant Life, the most popular, because it is one of our area schools, St. Augustine in Andover. And then for 9-12, you can see that the Shawshene Tech is where we lose kids at that grade level. Overall, 374 kids were enrolled out of district in grades 9 through 12 last year. There's some other schools that are obviously popular, like Austin Prep and Arlington Catholic, Malden Catholic. Our class sizes are comparable. We have some very good class sizes when you compare to comparable districts in the state. But one thing that's interesting about Wilmington Public Schools, that I think warrants noting, is that we're a little bit flip-flop from the rest of the state in that our K-5 average class sizes actually are larger on the whole than our classes at the middle school and at the high school level. Some of this is driven by class size target. The class size target at, as you can see, the class size target at the high school is 20 students for one teacher. At the middle school, it's 25 to 1, intermediate 25 to 1, and K to 3 is, pre-K to 3 is actually 20 to 1. So in many cases, we're above that in some cases. So I think this is something that we need to keep our eye on, because the research, what research there is around class size shows that the most important time to keep class size low is in these early childhood level, grade levels. And there are just, the average class size at the high school across the state, this might be in another chart, is actually 26. And this shows you class size by school. And one of the reasons why we felt comfortable that we could take a hard look at the high school with respect to FTE savings was because we note that 29% of classes at the high school have fewer than 15 students enrolled. So I think we need to obviously look at what electives we're offering, how we're scheduling students, and constrain schedules, not just to the maximum, but also constrain schools to, constrain classes to a reasonable minimum as well. And by trading in some of those positions, we get to fund some of those high needs positions that we've included in the budget. Personnel, what I think is important to see in this chart is that our number of general education teachers has actually declined. Where we're getting the pickup is in special education teachers, so as well as our specialists. Not any trend that's different from what other school districts are seeing. You know, it comes with increases in populations and increases in changes in trends in students with disabilities, health needs, etc. But this is where I just wanted to point out that it's not that we're increasing general ed so much that we are increasing in other areas. Educational assistance is another area where we've picked up about 10 FTEs over the past several years. Town manager gave you a little bit of insight into revenue, and I thought it might be helpful to kind of support that by showing you actually the breakdown of where those local revenues come from. And you can see obviously that your tax revenue is the bulk of the revenue. This piece right here, intergovernmental, a big share of that is your Chapter 70 and your general government aid from the state, your state aid. So those are the big pieces. And you can see, I think as Jeff was mentioning, that there's a lot of fluctuation in some of these categories, some significant fluctuation, which makes obviously revenue projection a challenge. When we report to the state on our expenditures, we report expenditures at a high level. They report that back based on 11 different categories of spending. These are the 11 categories of spending. The reporting of this data by each school district allows us to actually look on a per pupil, at a per pupil level, compares our spending on a per pupil level in these 11 categories to other district spending in those categories, which is very helpful in trying to determine, you know, what is our spending compared to other districts, like districts with respect to budget and enrollment, and are there areas where potentially we're underspending and overspending. That can be an indication that we can contact some districts and learn what they're doing differently, if they're spending less, or perhaps, you know, if we're spending more, where are they getting savings? What are the types of initiatives that we could put in place? But overall, you can see this is our level of spending in these various categories at a high level. And then down below, you can see the trend in the per pupil expenditures. And so 10,000 per student back in FY08, and as of FY14, 14,664. This year was the first year where we exceeded the state average. So prior to FY14, you were spending below the state average. Now we're spending above the state average. I will confess that if you do the math, it's more because the denominator in the equation is decreasing while the numerator is chunking away. So you got dollars per pupil, your enrollment's declining, and so that's where you're kind of seeing that increase happen. And and then you can see our enrollment, average district membership, what our enrollment has done, and you can see those declines here. And you can also see your population of out-of-district students. That does not include students that are out-of-district at private schools or placements. Those are kids that are out-of-district placements for special education. This is our per pupil expenditure by these categories, these different 11 categories, Wilmington versus the state. So what this graphic shows you is that, for example, administration, we typically spend less than the state average per pupil for administration. Similarly with instructional leadership, I think what places us a little bit behind the 8 ball there is that a lot of other districts may have some instructional coaching roles that we don't necessarily have. We do well with respect to classroom and specialist teachers. It's important to note that sometimes, though, this is heavily driven by the age, the demographic of your staff. If you have an older staff, you're clearly going to spend more in total and per pupil than a younger staff. Other teaching service, again, this right here, to me, is reflective of sort of that lack of instructional coach, instructional specialist position. This is an area that is somewhat of a concern, that we spend so little on professional development, but we have to remember that a part of this is also because we offer so many in-service credits, and we don't capture that here, we capture that here. It gets picked up as a salary expense because in-service credits translate to lane changes, and so once they get that lane change, that's compensation we owe every single year from that point thereafter. I talked about instructional materials, equipment, and technology. Again, our per pupil is relatively low compared to the state average. Do spend a little bit more, guidance, counseling, and testing. I think that that's a good thing. I think a lot of districts are struggling in the area of social emotional learning and behavioral health, and I think you'll probably see this number across the state be increasing as time goes on. I just wanted to point out operations and maintenance. We do tend to spend a little bit more. I think the challenge for Wilmington is around age of buildings and what it costs to maintain buildings as they age. And Jeff mentioned that the Health Insurance Advisory Committee is meeting. We spend a little bit more per pupil in this area as well, and so no doubt this is an area where if we are able to gain some savings by plan redesign and restructuring, that perhaps that trend may change. And I mentioned being able to compare our per pupil spending to other school district spending, and I think just a couple of things to point out here. Of these comparable districts right here, and I chose these based on enrollment, based on proximity, based on somewhat similar financial position, you can see that we spend for professional development second lowest of any of the districts that are in this list. You can also see that, for example, as I mentioned, for insurance retirement programs, we are, I think, the third, second or third highest there on a per pupil basis, second highest on a per pupil basis. So this just helps us understand our spending patterns vis-a-vis other school districts. This is an area where I think having some conversations about investments in professional development and what that looks like will be important as time goes on. With respect to special education specifically, what this table shows you on a comparative basis is what do we spend on in-district and out-of-district expenditures versus what other communities spend in that area. And in terms of the percent of the total special education budget, that's comprised by out-of-district tuition, you can see that Wilmington is at 48%, which is the second highest of these communities in terms of how much of our special education budget is going to out-of-district. What this tells me is there are some opportunities here that other districts may have identified for perhaps doing some program development and bringing some kids back into district and hopefully shifting this and saving some more money and putting that money back into in-district expenditures, not just for the sake of saving money, but because we want kids to be in our schools and be able to accommodate them in our schools. Some demographic information on special education population by disability category. Some of the ones that I've highlighted just show the areas where there's been significant growth in those particular categories of disability. You can see, for instance, communication, health, autism, neurological, and overall the number from, FY7, so over the last 10 years, there's been an increase of 121 students who are receiving services. In terms of where are our students placed compared to some other districts, you can see that this is the total enrollment for the district, and this is students, the number of students with disabilities and the percent. So our percent falls pretty much in line with the state as well as the comparable districts. There are some higher and some lower. In district, the percent of students with disabilities. You see where they're placed. So for ages 3 to 5, all placements, that's 12% of our in-district placements. 65% of our students are in what's known as full inclusion. 7% are in partial inclusion, and 17% are in substantially separate. I note that because it is the second highest of these communities on the list. So again, I think there are some lessons to be learned from some of these districts with respect to how to shift students from substantially separate settings into more inclusive settings. And it's for that reason that you hear us during this budget talk so much about the importance of professional development to support inclusion, inclusionary practices, inclusion consulting, UDL, all those things are things that will help us to be able to shift to more inclusive practices. This is information that Sue McDonald shared. I think she might have shared it with you as well, but you can see that steadily, there's this blip here, but certainly steadily the number of students who are receiving ELL services increasing, and also just the number and variety of languages that our ELL staff are needing to address. This is always a question for folks is, average teacher salaries and where do we fall? And we actually, we're only at the bottom because we're a W. Everywhere I go, I'm always the last to be introduced because I'm Wilmington. We got to flip-flop that and make the W's first. You can see that we fall in line with most communities. The median, we're a little bit below the median, but typically in line. But again, a lot of this has to do with the age of the staff. In terms of our achievement and growth, I include this information because so much of our budget is around supporting students academically, behaviorally, and in so doing, we're hoping to make the achievement gains and to close some of the gaps. What you see in this chart right here is our ELA MCAS achievement and growth. This is a percent proficient or higher. This is the median SGP. The ideal place to be is up in the upper right quadrant that shows high growth and high achievement. Here's where Wilmington as a whole, this big red dot, this is where Wilmington is as a whole, and these other dots represent the different grade levels. So we have some areas that we continue to work on, some grade levels. Overall, as you know, with the 50% line here, we are, and this X is the state, for the most part, all of our students are achieving, the percent of students achieving proficient or higher in ELA MCAS is as high or higher than the state, so that's definitely good news. But we do have some schools where even though the achievement is high, the growth is low, is median or low, and so those are areas that we seek to improve upon. And this is a similar chart for math. Again, here you see that we actually have some grade levels that are a little bit below the state with respect to the percent proficient or higher in math, or very close to it. Again, this is grade 10, which is achieving at a high level, although, more moderate growth. This is really the chart that I think it's important to think about and look at. This represents what's known as our achievement gap, our proficiency gap. This is MCAS ELA, high-need students versus non-high need students. These are the non-high needs, and these are the high-need students. And what you can see, and this is the state right here. So the state, you've got about 78% that are achieving proficient or higher. Here in Wilmington, our non-high need students are close to 90%, but our non-high need students are just below 50%. And so we would like to see, obviously, strong growth, and to close that achievement gap and to meet our CPI and our PPI, we would need to see the growth in this area be much stronger so that achievement-wise, these folks, these students are catching up to their peers that are in the non-high need subgroup. And for math, unfortunately, there's even a little bit more of a spread here. In terms of our comparison, MCAS, with respect to other comparable communities, you can see the data here, and for the most part, for these communities overall, for the percent proficient in advance, we rank around 11 or 12 out of the 12. In SGP, we do a little bit better. We're more around 7 or 8 out of the 12 communities. This graph is a testament to what a good job Paul does, and this just shows that he's a very good steward of the resources that we receive. And in every year, we have spent at or below what has been budgeted. And this shows our net school spending trends. I'm not sure how much time you've spent, understanding these numbers, but essentially, Chapter 78 is based on the financial needs of communities, and the way that this is established is that the state first establishes a foundation budget. The foundation budget, it's not a compelling definition, but the state defines it as the minimum amount necessary to provide an adequate education to students. We can all rally around that. The minimum amount needed to provide adequate education. So they establish the foundation budget, and then they basically say all districts need to spend at or above foundation. They then determine what is the financial ability of a community to pay, and that's based on income and property value. So the wealthier communities obviously get less state aid because they have a higher ability to pay. And the poorer communities get more state aid based on those two factors, income and property value. So what this shows right here is, whoops, didn't mean to do that. What this shows right here is this bar right here is the foundation budget, and this is the Chapter 70 aid that we have been getting in Wilmington. And you can see that the trend line is pretty steadily. There's been some blips here in there, but we've been overall state aid has continued to increase. This is the required net school spending, which is set essentially at foundation. Each district has to spend at their required. This is how much we're actually spending, and this is not uncommon in the state. There is a significant gap. Most districts are spending above their required net school spending, and statewide, on average, it's about 18 or 19%. It's for that reason that you saw the state last year form the Foundation Budget Review Commission to evaluate this, because it's a clear indication that what the state says is required to provide an education, even minimum adequate, is neither minimum nor adequate to truly fund education in our districts. And so I know Jeff talked a little bit about revenue at the state level, and the sense that given the state's financial situation, there's not likely to be more revenue. I try to be a little bit more optimistic and say that the work of the Foundation Budget Review Commission may result in the state recognizing that there needs to be an increased commitment of funding to education. So I'm hopeful. And maybe I'm crazy, but I'm hopeful. When we report to the state, we report not only the expenditures that we as a school department through our general operating budget spent on behalf of education, but what did the town spend on behalf of the schools for education? And while this number looks high, I just point out the fact that much of it in these last 2 years is a result of the school building project. And you can also see that the largest, other than that, is insurance. And Jeff talked about that, insurance for employees, both active and retired. These are the grants that we receive, and you can see that there were years where we received a lot of different grants, and that over time, the number of grants, including the ARA program, which went away once we got beyond that fiscal crisis, that the number of grants that we actually receive have been coming down. And so these are the grants that we currently receive, and the biggest one of that being the IDEA funding that funds special education expenditures, followed by Title I. And this is not a mistake. We did. This is driven in large part by the free and reduced population. And so when that population increases, because this is really aid for economically disadvantaged students, and you can see we had a big increase between 15 and 16. Revolving funds, these are our sources of local revenue, if you will. By local, I mean within the district. And you know, some of these funds we have available to us, some of them we don't really have available to us. For example, food service. Food service is a self-funded, they pay their own expenses from the revenues they generate, so it's not like we actually can tap into that money. But of course, if they incur a deficit, then we do actually have to take funding from the local budget to offset that deficit. But some of our bigger sources of revenue are the circuit breaker, which this is in a revolving fund, but as you know, that's a grant from the state to cover high-cost special education expenses. And then followed by that with our CARES program. Again, our limited ability to kind of tap into our CARES program, but what we're looking to do now is to tap into that money to provide more program at the middle school level. So we're always looking to take advantage of what we have there. So this is what we have overall as a balance as of FY15 in the various accounts. And the capital plan, just to review, we did make some changes to the capital plan as a result of the discussions with the town manager and his staff. We did make some shifts. We retained the funding for the foundations program to expand that to other grade levels. We pushed off some of the voice over IP system expenses, pushed that out to 18. We are going to continue with the elementary switch project. That's important for our infrastructure. We took the park laptop cart project and we shifted some of that to FY18, and we also are going to take some of that, some of the needs to purchase those park laptop carts, and we're going to charge them to some of our grant revolving and unrestricted funds to get that overall number for the capital plan for this year down, so that overall the town can balance all of its capital requests. We have a van that needs to be replaced. We talked to you during the balanced literacy a little bit about the units of study, the curriculum materials for the balanced literacy initiative, and also about materials for social emotional learning to be able to implement those programs, particularly at the elementary level. That's it. The end.
Wow, that is a lot to cover. Thank you. We'll open it up. Does anyone have, are we all?
Yeah, can we hear that again?
You know what the funny part is, being a humanitarian, I guess. I'm in the humanities side of education. I look at this and I'm sitting here thinking, Mary loves this.
That is true.
I'm like, okay. Very clear, though, the charts and the chart's really good, the graphs. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, Mrs. Vaughn.
So on one of the most recent slides, it was the aid that doubled because of free and reduced lunch. It went up to
Yeah,
200.
Title I.
So why did that increase so much? It was double any of the years.
Yeah, have you taken a look at that in terms of, as part of it, increase? I mean, part of it was an increase in the free and reduced population. We definitely did have an increase in that.
I don't think it was a significant increase. I think that there
Not
were
to-
more funds available, generally speaking. Federally funded.
I was wondering, I had found out that the Envisions book has disposables.
The Envisions book
I
has
didn't know where they
consumables, but we actually, when we brokered our deal with Envisions, it includes consumables for several years.
Oh, excellent. And I had a couple of other questions. Where we have specialists, I'm curious as to whether the specialists at some point, I hope none are here to be insulted, I'm not meaning it in an insulting way at all. We have specialists come in for a certain reason. You know, like we needed more help in the elementary math program, for instance. So we have a specialist. And with some of them, are we charting new territory and we're getting the specialists are doing it specifically for Wilmington and what we need? And do they outdo themselves out of their job at some point? Do you know what I'm saying? As specialists,
So
does
most of
that
the
work?
specialists that you saw, just to clarify, most of the specialists that we actually really only have one district level, district-wide, and yes, she is here, Mrs. Ippolito. But she's really K-5.
Right.
But every other specialist, if you will, that you saw up there, at least in that chart, is reading specialists and library media specialists and technology integration specialists and that population of specialists. I would say that as a district, I think we are fortunate that we have Lisa and we have Holly. They both do similar tasks, whether they're called specialists or coaches. They're very similar. They're supporting teachers around delivering instruction of math and literacy in the elementary schools. There are lots of districts that have a math and ELA coach in every school in the district. We have one math coach, K-5, and we have one. So I would say, I don't think they ever sort of just, outdo their useful life, for lack of a better term, because there's always shifts and changes. There's turnover in staff, there's new staff, so I haven't yet seen sort of the mass exodus of the coaching staff.
Okay, thank you. So that leads me to my other question. The ones that, the behavioral health that we're doing, is there a certain certification people have to be doing that?
Do you mean specifically the behavioral health coordinator
Yes.
position?
Yeah.
So there is no sort of licensure, DESE licensure for a behavioral health coordinator, and that's a position that more and more districts are adding by very different names. In fact, Boston Public Schools just added an assistant superintendent for social emotional learning, which is similar to the types of work, but probably even broader than what we're looking for. So it's more driven by the work that they're going to do. When we craft that job description, what we're thinking about is somebody who's is a licensed social worker, perhaps has a background in psychology or social work, and understands all the different types of services, behavioral health services that are provided in the district, as well as outside services and wraparound services, what's available in the community to direct families to as well. So this person will oversee a variety of different behavioral health providers, so to have that educational experience, and one of those licenses, school-based counseling licenses, I think will be beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? I just have a couple more. In the Shawshene School, I noticed that there were a number of classrooms with special students. And I'm curious as to whether the way it was worded and it's put down here, it's the first time I noticed this. Are we purposely doing that they're all together in a school? The special classrooms?
So, I mean, Wilmington Public Schools, this obviously predates me, not unlike other schools, it's not uncommon to have a particular school designated to house a particular program. So, for example, the Shawshene School houses a program known as Pathways and a program known as Reach, and they have different populations of students with different needs, and those students then transition to the West. The students in those programs are not don't necessarily reside in the Shawshene district or the West district, but that's where the decision was made to house the program. That is not an uncommon practice in districts. However, it's also not uncommon to see districts who are making a shift to a true inclusion model to start to try to not have school-based programs that take kids outside of their area of residence, but the ability to service any child with any need in their school. It does come along, with a certain expense because they're now taking staff and, perhaps doubling that staff. But there are, I think if we had strong inclusionary practices, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case.
And is that what we use for transportation, the minivans?
Mm-hmm.
For transportation,
Yes.
for that? Oh, okay. I can't believe I didn't know that. And the Chromebooks, accolades on the Chromebooks. That's what I'm hearing, Mr. Ellis. We finally got it, I think. But, so just add that, sorry. So we're all, okay, I guess we're all set. We want to thank you, Mr. Lay. It was going through this book, it's so incredible that you could get this done with everything else that you've been doing. I just don't know how you're doing it, unless you're here all weekend. We don't know that. But for everybody else, really, thank you so much. The time that you spend, these nighttime events, we really, really appreciate it. And the fact that you're open. I mean, I know some of these new things. We had a new superintendent who came in with her own ideas, but she listened for a year to everybody's ideas and what was happening and how things were going. And she made connections to everybody. And to the town side, she made those connections so that we're the benefit of, we're the recipients of the good work that you've all been doing. And the school committee really, really appreciates everything you do. So we wanted to just thank you. And that was an excellent presentation from both of you. So we really appreciate that you came this night. Okay. And we're done, except you can't go. Sorry. She can't go the rest. But thank you so much. All right. Yes. Yep. Our next item of business is going to be the policy. We've made some changes in our, updated some policies. And
Yes.
Mr. Superintendent will be doing that.
Thank you. I did want to acknowledge that, I know Jeff is here too, and Jeff is part of our Wilmington Substance Abuse Coalition, but also Chief McClellan is also here, and poor thing had to sit through this whole budget presentation.
I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. Very good. Glad not my budget isn't that complicated.
But I thank him for being here. He too is a member of the Wilmington Substance Abuse Coalition. Doreen is here as well, and she is a member of our Wilmington Substance Abuse Coalition. Jen Mason is another member who actually couldn't be here today for this presentation, but expressed, her desire to have been here had she been able to. And I bring this up because I actually want to start off with our policy JICH and policy JICHR. And policy JICH is the policy on drug and alcohol possession or use in school facilities and at school functions. We've given you a red line version to show you the changes that were made from the prior policy to the proposed policy. And in general, the bulk of the changes relate to the fact that drugs and illegal substances were not included in the policy. This was solely an alcohol policy, whereas MASC had made the change, a recommended change some time ago, that your JICH policy should obviously address both drug and alcohol.
Anyone have any questions on the changes?
I should note too that the policy subcommittee obviously has met and reviewed, endorsed all of these policies that we're discussing.
On the first violation of this, right?
So this is JICR that you're referring to? I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there's actually two policies. There's one that's JICH, and there's one that's JICH-R.
Yeah, I'm at the R one.
Okay.
Okay. So, the first violation, it
Can I
says,
just interrupt for a second? So I just wanted to give folks the context for JICR. So JICHR is essentially, JICH is the policy, JICH, I don't know why I have a hard time with that. JICHR is the regulation. So this is a policy and it is proposed to be revised. You did not formally have chemical health regulations. You had a policy, but not chemical health regulations. So this is brand new, that's why you don't see any red line. It's a brand new set of regulations. And just by way of context, as you know, the school committee will oftentimes revise and update and adopt a policy. Regulation is something that isn't always subject to school committee adoption. It's a school committee decision, and typically it's reserved for those things that are of such importance as to warrant adoption and deliberation by school committees. So this is the set of regulations, and I just want to give them a quick overview, and then we can get into questions. So everything that you see on page 1 and page 2, all the way up to the very bottom of page 2 where it says chemical health regulations for high school athletics and extracurricular activities. Those are basically things that pertain to this policy around possession or use in school facilities and at school functions. So this just articulates how we're going to deal with students, what regulations we're going to have in place for any student who possesses or consumes drugs or alcohol at school or on any school-sponsored events, okay? From that second page, chemical health regulations for high school athletics and extracurricular activities, the remainder of that policy, it goes beyond MIAA, and it goes beyond what we have done in the past here. First of all, it applies not just to athletics, it also applies to extracurricular activities. And it applies to anyone who is caught, and you can see that in here, is basically any student who is caught using drugs or alcohol. This is similar in some ways to MIAA because the way the MIAA rules work, if you are a student, if you're a student athlete and you are caught with drugs or alcohol, it doesn't matter whether it's on school premises or off school premises. If you're at a house party, what have you, there is, and the school district is aware of it, there is a loss of eligibility of 25% of competitions. So that is an MIA policy. We have been implementing and enforcing that policy and will continue to do so. What's different about these regulations is that it applies now not just to students involved in athletics, but students who are involved in a school-sponsored extracurricular activity. So that means a band, drama, strings, chorus, any of those school-sponsored activities. What it also does is it establishes that there are levels of violation So for the first violation, you are automatically receiving a 25% loss of eligibility. Again, that's consistent with the MIA policy. It's just different in that it's also applied to students in extracurricular activities. There is also, with the first violation, the option of the school administrator to require the student to participate in a substance abuse education, substance abuse prevention, or treatment program, and that decision would be made based upon the severity of the infraction, what type of level of activity the student was engaged in. For the second violation, right now the MIAA policy, that's where it stops. Okay, second violation, you would be assessed another 25% loss of eligibility. Our policy, our regulations are going further. Second violation, you're subject to a 50% loss of eligibility for participation in sports or extracurricular activities. And it's required that you would have to enroll in a substance abuse prevention or treatment program, again, depending upon the nature, but it would be required that you would enroll. And for the third violation, there would be 100% loss of eligibility for a year, and again, you would be required to participate in a substance abuse prevention education type program. So I just wanted to give them the background before we jumped into questions.
Sorry.
Can
I ask my question?
Yes, please.
Okay, so for probably any of the violations, I see that the students will be allowed to remain at practice or the meetings of the extracurricular activities. Now, how about tryouts? Like, I don't know, basketball, hockey tryouts or something, is that, can they go to that? Will they be considered? That's not really outlined, so.
Yeah, I mean, the student would essentially have to be participating in athletics, so if they're in tryouts and they hadn't yet been assigned to a team, then they wouldn't actually, there wouldn't be, you wouldn't know whether they were actually on the team or not.
Okay.
It's once they're a member of participating on that team or in that activity, that if there is an infraction, if there's a violation,
So they
that
can
is
still
assessed.
try out though?
Yes.
So they'll still be able to try out
Yeah.
and stuff, okay.
And then
And-
that penalty would go into that
Go into that
subsequent sport.
season,
Yeah.
correct. And the premise around attending practices and such, but just not competing, is that we want students to be actively engaged in activities that will keep them from participating in
Yeah,
other activities. But again, the ineligibility for competitions is the consequence.
Mhm. So it's minimum.
And would the coaches be aware, the coaches would be aware of that infraction during the tryouts, or?
I mean, there are
That's tricky.
many ways by which we find out, and we also have an agreement with Wilmington Police Department. So the high school administration is very well aware of what's happening, and so they're ultimately responsible for, the enforcement of the regulations.
Because I'm just thinking, if you're trying out, and you're going in there with 25%, you can't go, it's going to be tricky even for the coaches, I would think.
Now that we're talking about this a little more, during our subcommittee meeting, didn't we talk about the student, the penalty is going to be on that particular sport, so that, let's say a student's never played basketball, he's at the end of the football season, blah, 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 so he tries out for basketball just so he can skip games in basketball and not be penalized for the next sport.
Right, and there's language in here that basically says specifically
covers.
that covers that, so that
That's what
you
I thought.
actually have to cover, you actually still serve a consequence in the actual sport in which the infraction occurred. So it is intended to get around when a student, say, plays hockey and has never played track, has an infraction at the very end or in between seasons, and then decides, well, I'll go run track, and then I'll serve my consequence, and then I don't serve it. So there's still a piece that would have to be served in that season for that sport that they typically are participating in.
So where is that in here?
It
That is
is,
right here, the first violation, the second
I mean,
paragraph.
oh, okay.
It says plays football, he violates the rule, swings.
And then also under other, number 1, it goes into some pretty good detail about what happens when a student has violated the policy, and participates in a sport or activity in which they've not previously participated during high school in order to serve the loss of eligibility. So that item 1 goes into detail.
Mrs. Bunce?
There's only one piece that kind of, I know we discussed it at our policy meeting, is about those students who don't partake in extracurricular activities, which I personally find to be at more risk for for additional violations, and you want to try to capture them. That may be something to consider, how we can not just punish them, but try to, maybe rehabilitate is not the correct word I'm looking for, but support them into trying to get them back on the right path.
Well, I mean, I think that happens right now anyway. If we become aware of students who who have substance abuse, substance use issues that we're aware of, that's something that the high school administration, guidance, their counseling staff are going to work with. The issue is that we don't have any standing to administer any discipline because the infraction did not occur. This standing actually is more the consequence of that's attached to the privilege of playing a sport or participating in activity. We don't have that type of standing for just your average student who is caught at a house party. There's no way that we can enforce anything.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, this is our first reading of these anyway, so
Yeah,
we'll
this is
vote
the
on it at the next meeting.
First reading, and, due to the nature of this and the nature of the change, my plan is to actually share this out to the community so that there is an awareness that this is being deliberated. We certainly don't want folks to think that this kind of was passed in the dark of night, so we'll share that out with folks. I did share this out with all the members of the Substance Abuse Coalition, and I shared it with the high school administration, I shared it with Mr. Harrison, I shared it with Board of Health, and the reaction that I've gotten from all, as you can tell, they're here to support this, has all been positive, that even though the consequences are certainly serious, the real intent here is to find a way to channel these students to substance abuse prevention and education programs to hopefully get to that behavior and prevent that behavior from happening. I will say, just as an aside, long-term, I'm hopeful that we can create a program in-house that's staffed by our own staff to provide that substance abuse prevention education. But right now, in the interim, I have contacted Reading Public Schools, who has a substance abuse diversion program already in place, and they admit students from other districts. So at least in the short term, we're aware of a program that we can refer students to. So there is someplace we can refer to students to. We're also in touch with some of the other behavioral health providers to see if there's other alternatives, but that at least we know that there is that alternative for students to be enrolled in. Let's see, I'll move to staying in the theme of substances, I guess. The next two, ADCE and JICG, these are two policies that are essentially the same. They just appear in different parts of the school committee manual. One is under school governance and the other one is under students. These policies, as they originally were very different. It seemed to me that perhaps one was updated and one was not updated. So I've done two things. I've taken the non-smoking and tobacco use policy and I've updated it to include one, e-cigarettes and vaporizers, which is a new thing that wasn't around when this original policy was developed, and also reflects what actually happens with respect to offenses and violation of smoking policy. So that's ADC-E. And what I did on JICG is I just replicate, it's the exact same policy as ADCE. And there are several instances in the school committee handbook where the same policy appears in different places with a different policy number. But I think, obviously, these are two policies that should read exactly the same.
I got a little confused when I was doing this, when it talks about when a JICG, violation of the smoking policy will result in the following consequences, which is underlined, and then the consequences are crossed out.
Yes, so this is a red line version of what you used to have.
Okay.
So the cross-out is what was in there, that's proposed to be removed from policy JICG, and the items that are underlined have been inserted. And
Oh, so down, very down the bottom. Oh, okay. All right.
And so
thank
if you,
Oh,
if
get it,
if
yeah.
I were to take out the redlining, these two would read exactly the same.
Right, okay.
But we wanted you to see the changes.
I did the same thing when I was reading it. I went, oops, I found it. Okay, thank you. Anyone have any questions on this?
I think that the schools, the secondary schools will appreciate this because, you know, their student handbooks kind of came up with regulations absent a policy, so this gives them some clear direction on how to do that. So it's two, you will see some significant updates in student handbooks come this spring as a result of these two sets of policies.
Excellent.
And finally, last two policies, start with the easy one first, the easy one in that you've already adopted it. That's the social media policy. So if you recall, file IJNDD, if you recall, you approved a social media policy several months ago, just before the start of the school year. But we had an obligation to bargain the impact of the adoption of this policy with the Wilmington Teachers Association. We conducted those bargaining sessions over the last couple months, and what you see before you, the changes in blue, are the changes that were negotiated with the WTA. This has been re-reviewed by Andy Waugh as well, who signed off on it. And so, with that, if you adopt this policy as is, then it we'll have met our requirement to bargain and have an agreed upon policy by both parties.
I'm really glad that happened, because they're on the front line and they know what works and what doesn't. Did you have a question, Ms. Smith? Okay. All right.
And Neil is here, so he can help us through this one too. Neil and his team on the District Technology Committee, and others, I think you had others too, that participated on the development of this electronics device policy as well.
Yeah, it was mostly the district technology.
Good representation from a variety of schools and,
Like a subcommittee,
yeah. And so this policy essentially, a couple things that I just wanted to note, and I probably should have included them in this, but I took the policy subcommittee through this. You had a policy in place that was adopted somewhere around 2007, 2008. It was a very brief policy, maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs. Then in May of 2014, and I remember this well because I actually attended this meeting, I believe it was Dennis Mahoney, and I'm not sure if it was, I don't know if it was Terry Sheen that was with him as well, presented to you a new electronic device policy. You did a first reading of the policy, but you never did a second reading or adoption. So because of that, it would revert back to the old 2007 policy, which was just a few paragraphs. So since we had to address that anyway, and put that in front of you, we took the opportunity to make some changes in light of how we're truly using devices and what we're truly striving for with use of devices. You know, you mentioned Chromebooks, and we are seeing more and more devices in the hands of students, and I think we have to balance the protection of students and the digital citizenship with the ability of staff to be able to manage this and have the appropriate ability to direct students' activities, but also to open the policy up a little bit to allow for 21st century skills to be interjected into our schools, technology being an important piece of that.
Yes,
When we first did the electronic device, it was only for the high school.
exactly.
That's correct.
This is for all the
This is
schools
for all
now?
schools.
Okay,
Even elementary?
yeah. So they can bring phones in? Is this, or is it just computers? It's electronic device, right?
Yeah, we
iPhones
don't-
and stuff?
We don't, did you want to?
Yeah, it's not limited to any specific device, so it covers everything.
I think what's important is we're not suggesting that students are allowed to walk around the hallways with their phones. We're saying that if a student has a device in a classroom with teacher permission, based on the fact that it's being used for educational purposes, that device can be used, can be connected to our internet, and can be used for educational purposes.
Well, I think the assumption in the past had been made that only the high school kids would have such a device. Back then, it was probably just a phone. Now, that's in the hands of all kids, or potentially could be in the hands of all kids. So it's just a change that's happened over time.
I think it makes sense considering how the state's just driving the state assessment piece alone. It's, I think, a necessity now. Across the district.
I just think it's such a, maybe it won't be if we have a policy on it, but it just seems to me to be such a discipline problem for teachers. I don't know, although the teachers signed off on this one as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah, we built it together.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's something that, we're not gonna be able to turn the ship around at this point, you know. The devices are in the hands of the kids want to use them. They don't wanna come to school and unplug and go back 100 years and then leave school and plug back in, right? They wanna be able to use the tools that they have to enhance their education. So in light of our the one-to-one initiative that we're going to be looking towards next year, I mean, those devices would be devices purchased by families, students would have, and again, those devices would be, you know, from a teacher's perspective, this policy would kind of regulate the use of those. We'll add on to that probably for the one-to-one, but generally speaking, this would allow teachers to, I'm not standing in front of the microphone, I just realized. This would allow teachers to have control over the devices and when they're used. Basically, we're saying instead of a you can never use them until I say policy, it's more of you can always use them unless I say not to. So that's kind of the difference. I think the device now can be integrated into everything that the student does during the day to such an extent that when they shouldn't be used, the teacher says, please don't use them right now.
Somehow I don't know if we're being realistic or not, and I'll just tell you, this is how I've been kicking and screaming with the social media from day one. But when I look at that and hear this, I'm thinking about the classes up through 5th grade, the kids up through 5th grade. It says on here that they can have their use devices at any time and in any building, classroom, or setting, unless a staff member has specifically prohibited a student, et cetera, in the device. I think of what they're doing in the elementary schools. I do not know where they would have time to start using these devices. I don't know where they would have time to actually try and train those kids in a way because they're so young. But they have 2 hours of math every day. They have an hour of, and we're going to put in new reading. They have an hour of the reading. They have their take-out and take-ins, and I just don't know that this would apply to the, I don't know how anyone else feels.
I don't think
So
K through 5
I don't think K through 5 should be in this. I don't think middle school should be in this unless we've heard otherwise, because we promised them at the time that we did it originally, it would only be the high school. We would not go down to the middle school. Now we're going down to the middle school without knowing how those teachers really feel about it. And
This
we're
was
going to
built,
the.
this was built with teachers.
How'd you get
from-
by me on this one, Neil?
That was built with teachers
You're
from pre-K up through the high school. That's, all teachers were represented in that document.
What a change in a year. That's incredible.
Well, I will tell you this, so my son, he's 5, he's in kindergarten at the Greenwood Elementary in Wakefield. I had that same question myself. They use Chromebooks in their they have technology class, and they have Chromebooks that they use with the kindergartners. And that's like his favorite subject. He loves to go to technology, get on the Chromebook, and use it. So I had the questions about some of the things too. So we had a bunch of Chromebooks that we were setting up, and I took some home. And he had websites that he would not stop going on about these websites. And actually, one of them was Ms. Banashevitz is gone, but one of the things they do in kindergarten in Wakefield is the workshop model. And they've integrated some characters from some of the websites that they use on the Chromebooks to integrate part of the literacy. And he's like over the moon about it. He wants to come home, get on the Chromebook, go to this literacy site and play all the literacy games. I mean, practically taught himself to read in like a month. And then the science, they're also using the Chromebooks for science, and he goes to this one website called Priv, and he keeps doing this thing about the planets, and he goes on there for hours and learns about space and the planets. So I don't think it should be limited to any age group at all. I think it's there are opportunities to use it appropriately at every grade level, and I think the not having those resources available for students, I mean, I think it's just another way for teachers to differentiate.
But I think the difference for me is if we had them as a school system, and they were in the school, and it's a tool, it's being used as a tool.
Right.
But to have those little kids be bringing in their telephones or whatever else, I can't imagine they know how to, I know they're way ahead of us, but Mrs. Carroll, help me out here.
But I think I'm not looking at Chromebooks. Chromebooks are great for kindergarten, so everything you're saying. But for a telephone, for their iPhone or their iPad,
iPads, yeah.
or what's the little one? Not iPhone, but the iPod. Thank you. I think that's ridiculous. I don't think K through 5 should have that. That's my honest opinion. I think that's Chromebooks. You want to give them a computer? Great. Even an iPad. I mean, they can do their little, games and that web. But the phone? No, I don't think so. I think they're way too young.
I think
the parents are going to buy it.
Well, we're not talking about a bring your own. We're not talking about a program for a BYOD for kids bringing things in, but we are using tablets on tablet carts at the grades 1 and 2 right now. We have 2 tablet carts in each one of the 1 through 3 schools, and we found them to be very successful. I think.
Can you hold on? I'm sorry, excuse me 1 minute. Mr. Lewis, can.
No, I wanted to piggyback on what she was saying. What worries me is the phone part.
Yeah.
So you have a
And
kid
the
that's.
iPod.
Right.
Texting.
So, I mean, I'm reading here, teachers do not have the right to confiscate devices that are being used inappropriately. So what happens when someone's texting constantly, it's being used inappropriately? What recourse does the teacher have? Tells them put it away, they don't put it away, they continue texting in class being disruptive.
Oh, no, they can take it away. So
That's
No,
not what
that's
this
not what it
says.
says.
it says that they can, for the period, for class period. So what that looks like at an elementary level
class period.
can be much different. The class period in elementary is an entire day, basically, so
Lunchtime.
I think the appropriate way to look at this is to look at it in the way that schools have always traditionally looked at classroom management protocols. I wouldn't approach this any differently than that. If there's a student doing something distractive to other students or distracting themselves, that problem is dealt with, whether it be an electronic device or they're writing notes or they're playing with something else, a toy. The teacher can can manage that in their classroom. And I think there's a difference too with how much kids, I think, I wouldn't ascribe the problems that you see with social media at maybe the middle and high school level to kids at that level. They're not as involved in that at the elementary level 1 through 3. And I don't know that they all have phones with data plans that young. Yeah, so, I don't know, you're talking about digital natives, I think, as opposed to what we had when we were in grades 1 through 5. It's a different, it's hard to explain. You can't think of them as devices for just doing social media or calling, but as little computers. They're little computers that occasionally call. You know, that's really what they are.
Occasionally, oh, that was-
So it's, if you're, you know, I don't see a lot of phone use, more tablet use.
Definitely tablet use, I think. Mrs. Broussard,
I'd
were
be
you
curious
thinking?
to know what sort of requests we've gotten from parents at the K through 5 age to allow their children to bring in the devices. I see it as a parent management or a parental control issue, being that I have a control issue. Yeah, no, I wouldn't have allowed my K through 5 kid to bring in a device because those are expensive and I wouldn't trust my child at that age, nor was there a necessity unless I got a note from a teacher saying, if you happen to have such a device, we would like to try to use them on this day during this time period for this specific reason. Mr. and Mrs. Broussard, please sign off. Now that I have a middle school child, my child wasn't allowed to bring her phone last year as a 6th grader unless it was a day, like a ski club day, and she needed to be able to get in touch with me later. This is the first year that she's allowed, but several times I have gotten a request from a teacher, this is what we're going to be doing in the classroom on this specific day at this specific time for this specific reason. Here are all the rules that your kid and you have to abide by. Yes or no, sign off. So I feel like we're slowly transitioning that way as the kids age through. So I'm not opposed to what this is saying. I just think maybe there's some tweaks to the language we need to do. But it's our first reading, so that's the purpose of this.
I'm still in that old-fashioned thinking that I'm hearing about more articles that are being written, that kids are becoming isolated by their use of these machines, the electronic devices, and I see that sometimes at my own house. And it's like, wait a minute, so we've taken hours from the TV away to hours for the computer? Or I mean, what is the difference in some cases?
So what the difference is, I think, for me in this policy is to establish, part of this is establishing good digital citizenship. So what we want to do is, by introducing these devices and having them in a classroom, it gives the opportunity for the teacher to address those ethical issues in when it's appropriate to use these devices, when it's appropriate to have conversations with one another in the classroom, that this is just another tool to help in learning. And beyond that, here are the times when it's appropriate to use them and when it's not. If we don't teach the kids those things, what you'll see is kids coming home, not having conversations with their parents, just using the devices. There's no impact on that. That could be addressed in a health class.
If you go out anywhere, you see that the adults having no conversations with their kids because they're so busy talking on their little computer things.
Well, they should have had computers in school. We could have taught them how to talk to their kids.
I'm not convinced yet. I have to think about this.
So.
But
Yeah,
I think you're doing a great job of giving your side.
Yeah, I think that some of this is about what you're perceiving this is going to look like. Like, I think you're thinking this is gonna look like the adults going into Starbucks and doing, that we're turning our schools into Starbucks where anyone can come in with any device. I agree with whoever, I think it was Julie, about parent management. I don't know very many parents that are buying, I hear these conversations all the time amongst parents, what's the right age? And we do have, I hear more and more, it used to be 13, and then it was 12 and 11, and now I am hearing some 10s, which is 5th grade. But younger than that, they're not purchasing these devices for them. These kids aren't coming. But whether they purchase them or not, how is it that you, even if you establish that, if you just leave them out of it altogether and say, we're just going to make this about grades 6 through 12, if they have them, they're going to bring them to school.
I was just going
Yeah.
to say, actually,
May as well use
this is not encouraging people to buy
Right.
devices. This is a set of guidelines for people that may have them and bring them. We're not, nowhere are we saying, if you're in 3rd grade, please start bringing your phone.
Right, right.
You know, it's
Right.
honestly, this is just, these are guidelines for people who already have them. That's not, we're not publishing these in the town crier. This is, this is for policy and guidelines so that we can control
Right.
what already exists. That's the way I see it.
I have to read through
And they
it
have
again.
the right to allow, or the teacher has the right to allow or disallow the use, and that's really where the rubber meets the road. And I think if a student, if we don't address those earlier grade levels and they bring in that device in, you know, what if you have a teacher who is very technologically savvy and she's got a couple kids that have a smartphone and they bring them in and that teacher says, oh, you've got that? Well, let's use that. We can use that. Now what are you going to do? Tell that teacher, well, you just violated the policy. You should have, you know.
Right.
What do you do? Because
That's
it's going
what
to
I hear.
happen.
That's
I
what
mean,
I
it
hear all
is,
the time.
it's going to start to happen that kids are going to show up with these
Well,
devices,
to go
so.
with that argument, to go with Neil's argument too, is the idea that if we provide it and we have it there and we're doing it as a classroom tool, then I agree, that would be acceptable to me. But if we're letting them bring in, there's so many different devices. If we're letting them bring in helter-skelter, all these devices, I don't see how the teacher within the elementary school, with all the things that they're doing, possibly fits that in. And I don't want it to become a new thing in the curriculum, that they have to now start using these devices to teach something. That's where I'm thinking, and I can't get past it. And I
But
need
it's-
to know from the elementary people that that would be fine with them, because I don't think it's fine with the middle. I could be wrong.
But that's not what it says. It
But-
says that they may use it
Right.
unless a staff member says that they can't.
Yeah, this has got the teacher's discretion all over it.
Yeah,
Students may use
they
it.
wrote this, I mean, I
Unless a
didn't,
staff member
this
has
is all,
specifically
mostly elementary
prohibited.
teachers who
Yeah.
wrote this. I only have a couple of
But
secondary.
Did you want to talk?
I can say, I can add a little something.
Oh, okay.
to that. So at the elementary level, for the
you
math
wanna come to
program.
the-
I
Oh, yeah,
really
come
have
to
to,
the
in a loud
voice.
voice. I'll just project from here. Too tired. At the elementary level, so the math program itself has a lot of technology integrated into the program. So you could think of it sort of as students who are bringing in their devices, it's just an additional aid in the classroom to what they're already currently doing. So for example, even something simple as an iPhone or an Android device, there's a feature called bounce pages, where you hold the phone over the page, you click the button, the page appears right on your phone. So it's your actual homework page, practice book page, and they're working on it right then and there on their device. So it isn't an additional layer to what's already occurring in our already, text time in our classrooms, but it's an additional aid to,
So
curriculum.
are people already doing this, in other words?
They're using, like Neil said, in most of the buildings, there's Chrome cards, there's tablet cards. I mean, at the kindergarten level,
So
even
it's not their
myself,
own,
I'm
it's
actually
like,
going in and sitting with kids with tablets, and we're doing like a quick little assessment on the tablet, little kindergartners.
but whose tablets are they?
The tablets we currently have belong to Wilmington Public Schools.
I have no problem with that.
Yeah, right. But I'm saying, but there's one tablet card for the entire kindergarten.
Right.
Whereas if a teacher happened to say to a class, if you have a tablet and you'd like to bring it in, you can really individualize the instruction for that child on their own device, and maybe have more access to that tool.
think the same.
Thank you, Lisa.
The same thing that we're allowing to happen, for example, I mean, I know that your grandson has a device, and he brings it to the middle school, and while other students are using netbooks in the school, which are, somewhat on the outdated side, that he's allowed to take out an iPad and use an iPad because that's a device that he owns, that's a device he's familiar with, and that's a device that he's allowed to use. And the classroom teacher says, yes or no, your devices, they'll say things, lids down, power down, whatever, yes, you can use, yes or not. The reality is that just like, maybe Jared didn't have his iPad until 7th grade, we've got kids that are getting devices at iPads and iPad minis at 4th and 5th grade. And they are a technology tool to be used in where we can't provide that one-to-one type environment. If the teacher is willing and able and a student has that, why would we not allow that to occur when the teacher ultimately has the discretion to say, power up, power down? And the student handbook covers what happens if they don't power down when they're supposed to power down.
Thank you for all the explanation. I have to think about it. Does anyone have any more comments?
Maybe
Mrs.
we
Brissett?
could get a little analysis at some point that shows the discipline issues. How many, I'm looking right at you because you're here at the middle school.
Sure.
How often you have to discipline or a teacher has to discipline for improper use of a device?
I think it depends. I think a lot of times what our staff is really starting to do is use teacher discretion. We've got staff who are at varying comfort levels of technology, including that BYOD phone piece. I will tell you, it's a lot less than in my previous life. So I think students are becoming more able at the middle school level to manage themselves and not go to the bathroom and text or not text under their desk because they're becoming more familiar with that device. I think we have a ton of potential to leverage technology, either if it's the iPad coming in or the phone. Usually the phone is what we see the most. We've got kids going on scavenger hunts in the building with the codes. We've got teachers doing some foreign language stuff. We've got special education teachers doing some audio for students who may have some processing issues that they need that audio piece from books and discussions and all of those things. I think, are there issues with phones? Yes. Do I think it's I don't think it's as large scale of a discipline issue as I think it could be. I think our students are becoming better at managing that piece, but that comes with that digital citizenship. Time, place, and manner matters. And so as we prepare them to go to the high school, and I think probably Linda could talk about that too, I want them to be prepared, or our staff does, but we've got staff who have different levels of comfort with that. So we've got to acknowledge and respect that, but also kind of embrace some of the teachers who really want to kind of go full bore that way. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, that's good help.
And one of the things, they use this as an example, and this is effective at all grade levels, one of the things we encourage teachers to do all the time is to find new ways to assess for student understanding and to do it quickly, informatively, and authentically. And there are all sorts of apps and websites out there, Poll Everywhere being a perfect example, where a teacher can quickly put together an assessment and a student can use their cell phone, tablet, whatever, to respond. And a teacher can quickly say, oh my gosh, 65% of the kids picked C and the answer is A. I got a problem here, I got to reteach this. So those are the types of uses that we're seeing emerge that are actually really powerful to be able to help them instruct. And I just feel like if we're not going to be able to put those devices in kids' hands, and if they have them and we don't leverage that, then our district is going to be behind a lot of other districts in this state, in this country.
Yeah, I think by resisting this too much, I mean, kids in middle school and high school may have all these devices now, but in 3 or 4 years, who's to say the little kids aren't going to be having far more devices, maybe as they get more durable and more able to be dropped and not break. I think that we're trying to prevent the future by not acknowledging that this is going to happen at younger and younger and younger grades.
I think that's in bringing that topic up, not to think about things. I mean, that's easy to concur as to how society is being driven, but policy can always be rewritten with the change of the time. Maybe it is too much too soon. But as Superintendent Delay said, this will go out to parents to kind of get feedback, or was it just the substance abuse piece? I mean, it's really teacher-oriented kind of thing.
Yeah, this one is
so-
more teacher-oriented, and I feel like Neil did such a good job of putting together an interdisciplinary, intergrade level team that, you know, I think there's enough in here. I mean, certainly we do have an obligation to bargain, so we will have to share this with teachers, and so we can do that sooner than later. I actually don't know that, you know, parents would have as much of an issue, you know, as teachers would, but we can certainly send that out to everybody. But the initial conversation was about the other policies, the other regulations.
My biggest concern is that it's evenly distributed among students. You know, to have 3 students who may have a device and have some who are not, you know, who may not be able to afford it or whatnot. I just want to make sure that that no one is at a deficit.
That's already happening, though. That's already happening in our school district. That's an issue in every single school district. I've got more money, I've got an iPad, I've got the iPad mini, I've got the flip phone, you've got the Chromebook. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we're looking for that, to do the Chromebooks and to have devices, because if that happens and it's creating an inequity in the classroom, we can address it by providing an alternate device. But we can't necessarily do that in all settings. And what I see being done very effectively is kids sharing devices. So yes, I might have this device, but we're working together as a team using the device that you have to be able to do that collaborative 21st century teamwork together.
Mrs. Durrett?
And the other piece too for us, when we have those BYOD moments, if the student doesn't have a device, we provide an equivalent of something, so it's a netbook or now our new Chromebooks. So every kid has access, every student has access to technology, and it's done very discreetly. So I think we respect the fact that not everybody may have access to those pieces, but we want kids to be comfortable with that technology.
Thank you very much for clarifying.
And also be aware that we have filters in our buildings. I mean, I can't even get to my Facebook site, not that I'm surfing Facebook during the day, but on our WPS, using my device, WPS students, that Wi-Fi. There's blocks, so I can't get to certain areas. So we manage this as well to make sure that we're protective of, we're required to by law, but we also do it, you know, because it's the right thing to do to be able to manage the proliferation of devices.
Right, okay.
And I can't stream Pandora.
Nobody can.
Whatever that is. We'll call up Jared and find out. We'll be all set. He's my computer person. I love it. All right, well, if you get any other feedback on this, I would appreciate it on this part.
Yeah, and if I think what I would recommend too is if individual school committee members have particular things in here that just really makes them, you know, anxious, maybe just give us some insight into what you're thinking via email. And at the same time, yeah, we'll distribute this more widely and get some additional feedback as well. And we don't have to take this back for a second reading. In the next meeting, we can give it a little time, even though we might have these others that we take back for a second reading.
Even though my granddaughter's going to be really mad at me.
I think your grandson's going to be more mad at you.
Yeah, but he's working on her, and she's working on that little thing, whatever it is she does. I'm telling you.
There was one number on hand, number 6. We did make a little change, I thought, to that at the policy subcommittee, or we talked about it anyway, saying that instead of students should not check personal email, text, chat, blah, 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 we had said, you know, talked about changing it to we shall.
Yep.
The students shall not check.
This is the one I don't understand. See, in the back, your very last paragraph, outside classroom use. Students are free to use their devices outside of the classroom in any area of the school unless it is temporarily or permanently designated a device-free area by teachers, staff, as long as they are following the proper use protocol as stated above. I just think in a K through 5, I don't like that.
I also wonder about locker rooms, bathrooms.
Yes.
Well, it says they can't, but,
Yeah,
but there's no
Okay.
consequences. The teacher can't take it away, so if they get caught with them in the locker room,
Yeah, it doesn't
They
matter.
get- they just take away for the locker room, but then they get it the next
Well, wait,
period,
it just,
right? Am I not reading?
I think, I'm a little confused about,
I mean, number 11 says at no time is the device be used to take pictures, record audio, or video in locker rooms or bathrooms.
Yeah, but
maybe it should be under
I mean, you think
the
about,
last bullet.
you think about gyms, like everybody I know has a Fitbit, right? Maybe they're checking their heart rate or whatever it is during gym class, you know? So they have their device going through locker rooms, but they don't take them out and use video. I mean, they're integrated into everything.
But my whole thing is,
Can't stand it.
even if they do, that teacher will take that away at that moment, but then they'll get it back after that class.
Right. 'Cause I mean,
Because
they
there's no
might-
consequences of them doing that. That's my whole
No,
theory,
you
is
say
I
there's
think
no
there should be more
consequence.
consequences.
Consequences, I think, are determined by the principals or assistant principals for anything punitive. It's just that taking the device away shouldn't be necessarily a punitive measure, because the device may be used during the next class time period for educational purposes, where that kid would now be behind because other kids are able to use it in that next
They
class.
shouldn't have done what they did.
Sure, but there are plenty of other punitive measures to take,
You can tell I'm the
aside of
disciplined one in my
removing the
house.
phone, I think, you know. I think that's,
Punitive measures, excuse me. Punitive measures, I believe are in the handbooks, is that where those consequences?
Yes.
I think rise?
Yes, that's where they would come from the handbook. They'd be outlined in the handbook. So it sounds to me like what the committee is struggling with in particular is number 4. Teachers do not have the right to confiscate devices that are
Yes.
being inappropriately used for longer than their class
Yes.
period.
I
You feel that if a device is not being properly used, that teachers should reserve that right. So possibly we craft some language or talk about crafting some language that perhaps
The day.
softens it up, says that, they may have the right under certain circumstances, but rather than just absolutely straight out saying they cannot, I think it needs to be more situational dependent, context dependent.
I don't even mind if it goes to, the principals or the administrators has the right.
Discretion or something. Yep.
Exactly, like, that would make me feel better than teachers do not have the right.
Okay.
That, I
So
just
we
don't
can,
like
we
that.
can talk through that with and see what we can do, yeah. It's helpful to know what the ones that are really,
Kathleen, do you like this language better? Teachers have the right to confiscate a device for the entire period?
No.
Okay, I didn't know, because just by saying, I didn't know if your big problem
It
was.
depends on what they got caught doing, or what inappropriate use that they did.
There's a discretionary piece that you'd like to see introduced?
Right.
let me liken it to, say a student writes on the wall with his pen, and writes, draws out some kind of a bomb threat with this pen.
and they only came with one pen.
And he only came with one pen, and you take that pen away, and the kid can no longer do any work for the rest of the day with that pen.
Well, hopefully the kid won't be in the school then for the rest of the day if he did that.
Well,
Let's say it wasn't a bomb threat. Let's say it was
You're
just
assuming
graffiti.
say it was
teacher's
just
using it.
graffiti, wrote on the desk, or wrote on a piece of paper, I hate Mrs. So-and-so. We're taking that pen, and you can't do any of your work for the rest of the day. So-
He's not supposed to be doing
He's
that
not
work
supposed
on
to do
that.
graffiti. Maybe he should use it in the office.
Okay,
So
but-
if they want to ground him to the office, and he wants to use his phone to the office, then that's fine. He can go to the office and use his pen and do the work the rest of the day.
Neil, with that example,
Neil, I
you're
got teenagers,
assuming,
honey.
you're assuming that they're going to be using that particular device in the rest of the classes.
Which will be the
Or the
case when we
teacher will
do go to one-to-one.
I think it has to do more with the language.
Yeah.
I think Mary's right. If we
Definitely,
change the
yeah.
language and tweak it a little bit, I think it's just, the way that it's written, you're restricting the teachers from not being able to discipline if someone's not using the phone properly. And I think if we tweak the language, we can still keep this as is. We're just not restricting the teachers based on the language that's written on, the way it's written.
I just don't want to put kids at a deficit.
No, you're not. You're not. It doesn't mean that they're,
Yes.
Is that typically used in conjunction with the technology, the tools that they're?
It can be. See, I'm thinking, my head isn't, we could talk about it more, but my head's more in the space of a one-to-one where every kid has it and every teacher is utilizing that device in every classroom throughout the day, and where you take it away, now the kid's at a deficit for the rest of the
Do
day.
you understand, though, this policy can also come back for revision?
Sure,
As
sure.
we continue to grow our
Sure, sure.
technology piece?
Yeah.
So that's not without, that's not, there's options as we approach
Sure.
and increase our technology base and such, too.
Okay, I think we should, it's getting
Yeah,
late,
it's
we're
off.
getting tired, it's time to move on. But Neil, good job. And thank you, ladies, for adding to the conversation, we really, it's helpful, very helpful. Okay, now we're at, okay, personnel report. We had that to look over.
It's a very brief report, it's just an update in terms of the turnover that's happened so far, year to date.
And the next thing is the SEAM Collaborative Annual Report and Audit.
Yes, and this is something that the board of the directors of SEAM Collaborative needs to adopt and approve, but we just have to provide it to our individual school committees as a point of information. So this is the information for you.
Anyone have any questions about it? Another excellent report. Oh.
Yes, Kathy does a nice job.
Now, our policies are all done. We're up to public comment. Are we having?
Hi, I'll be brief.
Sure.
Nice to see you all again.
You too.
David Ragsdale. I wanted to make a comment and ask a question. The comment is about the technology discussion we've been just having, because it hasn't gone on long enough yet. So, I think one of the issues that there's been some discussion about sort of the ad hoc use of technology, that when students happen to have devices and then the teachers can find ways to take advantage of that. I think I share some of Ms. Burns' concern that for students who don't have that technology, that there is, another kind of deficit. We've talked a lot about we don't want students to have a deficit, but if you're the student who doesn't have, an iPhone, can't afford a tablet, doesn't have your own iPad, then it's a little bit harder to be thoughtful about how we make sure that really there is kind of an equal opportunity for everyone to get the benefits of that technology in the classroom. And then especially going down at the elementary levels, it also puts a certain pressure perhaps on parents who may not want their kids to have these devices as early as other parents do. But now if other kids are bringing them into school and they get to use them in school, then that's another factor of whether parents are controlling, when their kids have access to technology that's not just used, of course, for school purposes. So that's something that I think should be brought into consideration. The question I had, which is on a completely different direction, is I am curious if there is any discussion at all in the district, in the superintendent's office, about the ballot measure to revert to the pre-2010 curriculum frameworks. Or if that's a kind of when we get closer, we'll worry about that, if that looks like that's a possibility. I didn't know if there was any thoughts or any discussion with MASS about how districts could handle that.
We haven't talked about, like, if this happens, this is what we'll do, because I think we're all praying and hoping that that doesn't happen, but MASS certainly is very involved on the, the advocacy end of that, to the extent they can be. But no, we really haven't had any discussions other than, holy cow, I hope this doesn't happen.
All right, so where I think most people are right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any other public comment? Okay. Other reports? Nope. No other reports? None tonight? None tonight? We're all set then? Okay. Correspondence? None tonight? Okay. Future meeting dates and agenda items, right? The Board of Selectmen has invited Mary to come to their meeting next week, the 25th, so if anybody's available to be there also, and it's about changing the voting, I think you might have already seen this or know this, changing the voting voting polls.
Locations, yeah.
The locations, thank you. Changing the locations away from the Boutwell and the Wildwood School. And they had quite a discussion on it at their meeting, so if you ever get a chance between now and then to look at their meeting, you'll see that she has a formidable role to play on the 25th. We go there.
What time and?
7.
7 o'clock.
Yeah, 7.
The meeting starts at 7. We have not finalized the agenda yet. It'll be finalized tomorrow, but I would expect it'll be early on in the agenda, perhaps 7:15 thereabouts.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then our next, and then on February 1st, we could put down, the town manager will be presenting his budget, and we normally go to that and support his budget. And then our next meetings would be February 10th and February 24th. Okay. We all set with that? All right. I'll entertain a motion to it. Oh, sorry. Yes. Quickly, yeah. I would entertain a motion to adjourn to executive session from which we will not return. Mrs. Carroll?
So moved.
Second? Mrs. Broussard? All right, here we go. Mrs. Burns?
Yes.
Mr. Bjork?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonish?
Yes.
Mrs. Carroll? Mr. Mullis? Mrs. Broussard? And Mrs. Kane, yes. Thank you.